All right, take two. There are two pieces to NTLM attacks. The idea behind an NTLM attack is we're taking this NTLM authentication material from somewhere, and we're either grabbing the passcode from it or we're relaying it somewhere else, right? So two pieces to it. The first one is we need to get that authentication material. And the second piece of that is either cracking it to get the password or relaying it somewhere. And as we talked about last time, although I am saying get this authentication material, really it's kind of more complicated than that. Like we're putting ourselves in the middle of the connection and doing this back and forth exchange. But for all practical purposes, you can just think of it like we're grabbing this hash, right? And we can either crack it or we can relay it. So far, so good? Yeah. All right, let's talk about how we get it first. So these are the different ways that we can grab the hash. I have them listed on the left here. These are the main ones. There may be some other ones that I didn't include, but these are the main ones that I use. So first of all, we have LLM&R, MDNS, and DNS poisoning, which, as we talked about, these protocols, LLM&R, MDNS, and NBNS, are used to convert names, domain names, to IP addresses, right? So like pc2.cptc.local would be 192.168 blah blah blah. In the event that this is usually handled by a DNS server through DNS. However, if the DNS server doesn't have a record, then by default, Windows especially, but other devices too, will reach out over these broadcast protocols or multicast protocols and basically just ask, does anybody know who has this IP address? Who has this domain name, right? And poisoning means sending false responses. So as an attacker, we can respond, say, I have that domain name, here's my IP address, and then further communication will happen with your attacking machine. And so then in subsequent interaction, your attacking machine can request authentication, and it'll send you that authentication material that you can then use as you please. So that's one option. The second option, DHCP v6 spoofing. So that's where when a machine joins a network, it requests an IP address over DHCP, right? Unless it's configured statically. But if it's not configured on the machine itself already statically, it requests an IP address over DHCP. And basically it reaches out, it says, hey, I'd like an IP address, and then a DHCP server responds to it and says, here's your IP address. And it also adds additional information like DNS servers, that kind of thing. Now, most of the time, or by default, I should say, Windows prefers IPv6 over IPv4. Remember, there are two kinds of IP, IPv4 and IPv6. On internal networks, however, most of the time, you'll see admins preferring or using IPv4 because it's a lot easier to manage and understand. IPv6 is just more complicated, more difficult to manage, though it does have some security benefits that I don't completely know off the top of my head, right? But as a consequence, we can use a tool like man-in-the-middle 6. So machines have been assigned IPv4 addresses, but they may not have necessarily been assigned IPv6 addresses, right? And if they haven't been assigned IPv6 addresses, then we can pretend that we're the DHCP v6 server. We can say, hey, we noticed that you haven't received an IPv6 address yet. We're going to assign you one. And in addition to that, we'll give you some DNS servers that you can use. And those DNS servers will be our attacking machine. So then, similar to like the top poisoning one, when it goes to try to resolve a domain name, now it's using us as the DNS server. We'll say, okay, that's actually us. And then it'll authenticate to us, our attacking machine instead, and we can request credentials. The difference between poisoning and spoofing, the difference between LLM&R, this poisoning attack, and this DHCP v6 spoofing attack, is that with poisoning here, we're relying on mistyped or incorrect domain names that could not be resolved through DNS normally. Whereas with DHCPV6 spoofing, we are sending false responses to any request. So, as you could imagine, if DHCPV6 spoofing works, it's often much more robust than the LLM&R poisoning, because we can answer all DNS requests, not just those that are the result of a mistyped name. So far, so good?
Yes.
Makes sense? All right. In addition to that, we have this idea of coercion. I'm going to skip this one for now because it's kind of a special case. We're going to look at these down here. So there are 5 different ways to force a machine to authenticate back to you. And whereas with DHCPV6 and LLM&R, or MDNS, NBNS, with these, you could also get user hashes, right? So maybe some users doing something they mistype a share. With these, you're going to get machine account hashes because you are reaching out to the machine and coercing it to authenticate back to you. Make sense? That's what the idea of coercion, also sometimes referred to as forced authentication. They both kind of mean the same thing. There are 5 different ways, known ways to coerce. They do require having domain user credentials, right? So this is only applicable if you're already on the domain and you want to potentially elevate privileges, right? Each of those kind of has the original tool that was meant for that attack. So for example, Petit Podum, DFS coerce, Shadow coerce, and those are the kind of the common names that we use to refer to these, even though they have technical names, like the actual protocol that they're using is kind of the technical name. But in addition, very recently, actually within the past month, maybe even within the past 2 weeks, NetExec released a new module that allows you to do all of these coercions without having to download any of those actual tools. You can just use NetExec, right? And as you probably remember, we've been using NetExec for a lot of other things, so that makes it pretty easy. There's also a tool that I did not include on here because I figured you have enough ways of doing this. That's called Coercer. And Coercer also is a standalone tool that combines all of these methods, and you can kind of select which one you want to use. But as long as you remember NetExec and the original tool, I can't think of a case where you would need Coercer, right? So, any questions about that, about coercion or forced authentication?
For this to work, I need domain credentials.
Yes, you need domain credentials.
Which we don't know yet whether we're going to give us or not. If they give us, then we can try all these different things. If they don't, I can try to get them or try to.
Yeah. So if they don't give them to you, you're going to have to try to get on the domain. And the way you would try to get on the domain if you're doing NTLM attacks is these 2, basically, right? We'll talk about this special case in a second. But these 2, right? And then when you're on the domain, let's say you want to elevate privileges, we'll talk about, this will make more sense when we talk about in a second common attack paths, right? But this will come in handy when we're trying to elevate privileges to get specifically the machine account hash for a domain controller, right? Think about what might happen if you could coerce a domain controller to give you authentication material, and you can authenticate as a domain controller. Well, you can do things like DC sync, for example, right? So that's where this comes in handy. But yes, you already need to be on the domain. All of these authenticated ones here.
As a user.
As a user, machine, anything. As long as you have an account that is valid on the domain. And in fact, even though I put these commands with a password, most of these tools also allow you to use a NTLM hash or a Kerberos ticket instead if you want to authenticate rather than a password. So even if you don't have the user's password, if you have a hash, that's enough to do coercion. Questions so far?
No.
Go for it.
Okay, with responder, I need someone to mistype something.
Yes.
Otherwise, I'm just going to be waiting.
Yeah.
Say I don't have domain credentials for anything, for any machine or any user.
Uh-huh.
And I run non-responder. I've been waiting. There's no mistyping. So DHCPv6 users are the only.
So then DHCPv6 is going to be your next bet. And if that doesn't work, you aren't technically out of options. Like you could do ARP poisoning or things like that. But these are the big ones. And honestly, these are the only ones well, that's not true. We try ARP poisoning, but not in the context of this.
Sorry.
Go for it.
If that doesn't work, okay, I'll just try to enumerate users.
Yes. So something we talked about, you and I talked about last time, and I will actually go over this when we talk about service attacks, because I kind of consider this more of a service attack kind of thing. But SMB, if misconfigured, so there are a number of different scenarios that could lead to this misconfiguration, and some of them are Active Directory related, and I want to say some of them are not. But if it's misconfigured, you may be able to get a list of domain accounts through SMB unauthenticated. And if you have domain accounts, another thing you can try doing is password spraying, or taking a common password and trying it against all accounts. But that's separate from NTLM attacks. We'll talk about that later. But yes, absolutely. That would be a good next step. Cool. Any questions about this left-hand side right here? Okay. So let's talk about, and by the way, see these asterisks? I meant to put a note about it, which I forgot. I'll write one down. Wherever I put an asterisk, that means only run it for a short period of time, because it is potentially I shouldn't say dangerous, but MITM6, for example, if you're responding to all domain requests, then users can't access legitimate domain resources, right? Because you're poisoning it. So you don't want to keep that going for too long, because that's going to interrupt business. And similar thing with responder -W capital F. That one may cause pop-ups, and so you don't want users complaining about a bunch of pop-ups. And so that's why I also marked that one with an asterisk. But just remember that the asterisk means run it for a short period of time. Whereas anything that doesn't have an asterisk, you can run it as much as you want. Doesn't matter. So far, go ahead. Question.
What is HB, Callie?
Okay, so I didn't actually talk about the commands yet. Okay. But if we're talking about the commands, so with man in the middle 6, you can either poison all domain name requests, or more useful is to just poison the ones that are going for the domain that you're trying to attack, right? So -D allows you to specify the domain that you're attacking, and then it'll only poison DNS requests for those. The HB is a host block list. So when you're doing DHCPv6 spoofing, if that's the only thing you're doing, you don't need it. But if you're also running other things at the same time, you don't want to poison yourself. So the host block list just says avoid poisoning this device. So for example, if you're all working together in the competition and you're all on the same network, let's say, and you run this, you may want to add -HB and then the host name of all your machines, which will probably just all be Callie. But if it's something different, you might want to add that just so that if others of you are doing other things at the same time, you're not interfering with yourself. Same thing for the Windows machines too. I just put -HB Callie to kind of showcase it. But also for your Windows machines, I would grab the host name to HB Windows machine host name.
For every additional...
For every...
I do -HB Callie.
Yes, you can just add them on there. Yep. And for every machine, basically, that you don't want to spoof or you don't want to poison.
We could just, make a text file and add.
Yeah, I don't know if it accepts a text file. It might. I wouldn't put it past MITM6 to accept that, but this is the way I've always done it. Because to be fair, when you're testing solo, there's two machines you have to worry about: your Linux machine and your Windows machine. So, yeah, I'm sure. I'd imagine it probably accepts a. I'm kind of curious now. This will probably be quick to look up.
As a competition logistics, just in communication kind of thing, I forgot until now. I usually make a sheet of paper where with all for example, for CCDC, all the passwords and usernames for different accounts, and then we all just take turns writing in our made-up passwords for it, so that we all have a sheet in one place. So I'll totally do that again. So that'll be for each of our Kali's and Windows, but then also for like things like sysvector.
Yes.
That's a good idea.
And which machine sysvector is on. I'll just make a little.
And a note I want to make, all of these commands on this left-hand side, by the way, you can't, from what I can see, at least on the help screen, it doesn't let you provide a file, but you can provide it in the command. You can always do fancy things like put two backticks and like put a command within a command. Just be like cat the file and then use some sed to add -hb in front of every line. Yeah, you can do fancy things like that. But yeah. Anyway, for each of these commands, you only need one of them to make this work. These are all just different variations, right? So for example, under these coercion attacks, I gave you the original tool, how you would do it with the original tool, and how you would do it with netexec. But you only need to use one, right? When we're talking about responder and poisoning, there are three that I like to try. But typically, if poisoning has not been mitigated, the first one works. So I would always start with -w, and if that one, for whatever reason, you're not getting anything, you can try the other two. But that's why in my like examples here, I just went with -w everywhere. But I just wanted to kind of point that out. When I get to the middle of the table, you'll notice that I only selected one of the commands from here. But I just want you to know that it doesn't matter which one you select. You could have done either one. Make sense? Okay, the last coercion attack we didn't talk about because I said it's a special case. It is related to a 2022 CVE. That's petit podum without credentials. So if you're running with if you encounter a domain controller that has not been patched for this, you can actually run petit podum without needing domain credentials at all. So with netexec, you just don't specify the username and password. I actually have not tested this, but I would assume it works. But for the original tool, which I have tested, again, you don't provide a username and password. It authenticates with a null session and then does it. So we will talk about null sessions later. So I believe if null authentication is disabled, it won't work. But in most cases, it's enabled. Don't quote me on that, though. Okay, any questions about these on the left-hand side? There are different ways of getting that authentication material. Okay, probably a lot easier to understand. Two things we can do with them. We can either capture or we can relay. So here's where it gets a little confusing. Responder is used for two different things. It can be either used to capture credentials, right? But the other thing it does is it does poisoning. So in some cases, when we end up combining these in the table, you'll see I'm using responder. Here, I'm using responder to capture the credentials. But here, I'm using responder to do the poisoning. So that's where it gets confusing, that it's like one tool to do multiple things. But that's why I gave you this table, and I just wanted to make that note. And that's why I put this -a in parentheses. -a is analyze mode, so it won't actually do any poisoning. But if you want to do that LMNR, MDNS, NBNS poisoning, you just would replace that -a with whatever you want to replace it with to do the poisoning, and it would automatically capture the credentials. Losing my voice. Does that make sense? The responder thing that's used for two different things. Cool. I'm not going to talk about all the things you can do with capturing credentials like we talked about last time. Like you could use rainbow tables if it's the net NTLM v1 under specific conditions. Because in the real world, honestly, I just try to crack it. And if it doesn't crack, I try to relay it. And one of those gets me somewhere, right? I've never played around with all those, like, maybe I can downgrade it from net NTLM v2 to net NTLM v1. And I don't even know all the nuances with that, so I don't want to try to explain something that I don't fully understand myself. Make sense?
Doubt, okay. So when we use for analyze mode, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's when we use relay. NTM relay, right? To relay the...
No, so analyze mode, as you can see here, analyze mode is under this capture column, right? Not under the relay column. Because what analyze mode does is it just captures the credentials without doing any poisoning. If you're relaying, you don't need to capture those credentials because you're going to relay them. right? NTLM Relay X also captures those credentials, but rather than giving them to you, it relays them. And yes, you could technically also capture credentials with NTLM Relay X and not use responder at all. I'm forgetting now what the flag is. There's a flag for that, but I never do that. Also, doesn't have as many servers as responder does for capturing credentials, and doesn't give you it in as nice a format. So,
what is it relying on when it's capturing? Because with the -w-p, it's relying on LMR enabled and it's enabled, etc. So for analyze, what are they doing?
So the analyze, so that's why the capture column is combined with these rows, right? Because alone, if you just ran responder-a, you would get you wouldn't ideally get any credentials because you're just sniffing, right? But when you start combining it with these, and that's where we have these inner boxes here. As you can see, I'm running responder-a, but I'm also running the command that's going to get me that authentication with it.
I see. So
Makes
that
sense.
one's just like the general idea.
Yes.
Like this is
So here we're talking about how we get those credentials. Here we're talking about what we can do with them, right? And so now if you look at these boxes in between, let's say I want to get the credentials with DHCPv6 spoofing and I want to print those out. So DHCPv6 spoofing, capture, line up here, you have these two, right? So I combined this and this, put them together.
Okay.
Make sense? I know, doesn't it help to have it in a table? It's like, okay. And then the second thing you can do, besides capture, is relay. So if you capture those credentials and you try to crack them and you can't crack them, the next thing I would do is I would try to relay them. And to relay them, you use a tool called NTLM Relay X. Note about NTLM Relay X, by default, it only listens over IPv4, but not over IPv6. So if you add -6 to the command, which you can, as a general rule, if you wanted to, you could always add it, but then you might be just capturing like unnecessary IPv6 traffic. But if you need to capture IPv6 authentication material or credentials, you have to add that -6 flag. So you'll notice when we do DHCPv6 spoofing, I'm adding that -6 flag. Also, in some cases, when you do LMNR, MDNS, NBNS poisoning, let's say IPv6 is being used in the network, you might see like IPv6 addresses being poisoned, right? And if you do want to capture or relay, I guess, the creds from those, you have to add that -6. So that was a little note about the -6. Makes sense. That's why I put that one in parentheses too. Question?
Sorry.
No, questions are great.
Okay, so say that I ran responder
Mhm.
with -w or -p, and I see that LMNR response sent or whatever, but I didn't get anything back because nobody mistyped anything. So would I go and put a vulnerability LMNR is enabled, but exploitation did not happen? So it's still
Yes, correct. So somebody did mistype, or either somebody mistyped something or the machine is just configured to reach out on a non-existent, to a non-existent name, right? But maybe you don't get credentials from it, which is fine. And then I would just say that no, because if this were properly remediated, you would not be seeing this traffic in the first place. So you know that it's still a vulnerability, and it might just so have happened that in the time that you were testing, you didn't get credentials. But an attacker who tries this later on, maybe they could, right? So that's why if you look at, since you wrote that one up, oh shoot, I'm not connected to the VPN here, but I'm connected to the VPN here. If we take a look at our report, too much time. If you take a look at our report, though, and you look at those proof of exploitation instructions that I wrote for you, I put a number of different scenarios. And the first scenario that I put is in this instance, no authentication material was received in this instance, right? So that's where you would use that proof. So I gave you a few different proofs depending on what you end up doing with it, like whether you capture, whether you relay.
Follow-up question to that.
Mhm.
So if we did not get credentials for it, can we use a petit totem with responder?
Yeah, well, these are all different ways of trying to get credentials. So if this one doesn't work,
Okay.
go for it. Try this one, right?
get a machine account.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're really lucky and Petit Podum does work against a domain controller, you can jump straight to domain admin without, or I guess technically not straight to domain admin, but you can jump straight to full access over the domain without even going through low privilege to domain compromise, which is best case scenario for you. So definitely worth trying. And so as well, this will make more sense when we talk about what we do with these. But normally machine accounts don't have many privileges in a domain, right? Normally they just control the services on that machine, and that's it. So normally these aren't super useful, but they're useful in two cases. Case number one where they're useful is if it's a domain controller, because if it's a domain controllers can also DC sync or request replication, because that's a legitimate domain controller thing. So you can get the hashes of all users. So that's one scenario where these coercion attacks will be useful. And the second scenario where these coercion attacks will be useful is if you want to get local admin on the machine. So using the machine account, you can do resource-based constrained delegation, request a service ticket on behalf of a user to that machine. You can also do shadow credentials and then S4 U2 self. So shadow credentials will get you the NTLM hash or ticket, whatever you want, of that machine. And then from there, you can use that to request service tickets on behalf of users. Fun fact, if this is like too much for your brain, don't worry about it. But just in case any of you have ever heard of a silver ticket attack, silver ticket is basically the same thing as an S4 U2 self, but just less stealthy. So that's why I've learned to always use an S4 U2 self, because it's equally as easy. And if you're red teaming, that's the stealthy way of doing it, because there's actually a request associated with the response rather than just crafting the ticket yourself. If you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. I just wanted to throw that out there in case any of you have a silver ticket and are like, why are we not talking about silver ticket attacks? That's why. Okay. Anyway, with relay, use NTLM relay X basically. And you're going to use -T to specify the target that you want to relay to. And now you will be adding on to this NTLM relay X command depending on what you want to do with it. But we'll get into the things that you add on when we get to the next piece of this, which is talking about relays. So questions about this so far, capture relay, and then here are the different ways of getting that authentication material. Make sense? Okay, so now how do we combine these? Well, if I want to do, let's say, LM&R poisoning and I want to relay it, I'm going to take one of these from LM&R poisoning, and I'm going to take this from relay, and I'm going to put them together. And these are the two commands that I have to run. Make sense? Just combining the boxes. Note, I was very particular in the order that I put these commands because responder and NTLM relay X. Remember, responder can also capture credentials. So, but in this case, we want NTLM relay X to capture those credentials so we can relay them rather than responder. So if we run responder first, it's going to start all its servers for capturing credentials. And then when we try to run NTLM relay X, it'll complain that it can't start its servers because the responder's already running them. So that's why there are two ways of approaching this. The more hardcore way is you could actually go into the configuration for responder. And if you took the TCM security courses, he does this. You can go into the configuration of responder and actually disable the servers that NTLM relay X is using. Or the easier way is just run NTLM relay X first, and then when you run responder, those servers will just fail to start, but that's fine because NTLM relay X has those servers started. Make sense?
Yes.
Cool. All right. So that's why the order here is very important. And for the most part, you want to that's why I put NTLM relay X first everywhere. For these, for example, when you're doing the coercion, you need to do the coercion after you started the thing that's going to pick it up, right? Because otherwise it doesn't make sense to do the coercion first and then start NTLM relay X because you'll have missed that authentication that happened. Make sense? And then when it comes to the one kind of caveat to this, when we're running MITM6, we have to run MITM6 first. because there are servers that MITM6 uses to do that, to respond to DNS requests, right? That responder would only use for capturing. And because in this case, we're using responder for capturing, not for poisoning. So that's why we run MITM6 first, so that then when responder runs, it doesn't conflict. So general rule, always run responder last if you don't want to, or you can use this table. Cool. Any questions about this so far? How we actually receive that authentication material? Question.
Relaying should be the last step, because if we capture, then we don't have to do that, right? So first I would capture.
Yes. So if we're talking about this from an attack perspective, the first thing I always try is I try capturing, and I see what I get. And if I'm able to capture hashes, then I try to crack them. No, I leave it running. I might leave it running for an extended period of time. Well, if it's responder, right? I'll leave it running, but I'll try to crack them. And if I can crack them, well, I already got domain access. And assuming that's my goal, we're good to go. But if I'm not able to crack them, that's when I'm like, okay, now I'm going to move to relay. And certain accounts, I'll get to your question in a second, certain accounts it's not even worth trying to crack. For example, machine accounts, domain controller accounts. Those have by default been assigned a randomly generated, difficult to crack password. If an administrator could, if they wanted to, like manually assign it a different password, but I don't see why they would go out of their way to do that and assign it, on insecure one. So that's why for this coercion, I usually wouldn't capture it in most cases. I would usually just go straight to relaying it. I might capture it to check if the coercion works. So I'd capture it to check if the coercion works and then relay it. But if we're talking about DHCPV6 spoofing or LMNR, MDNS, NPNS poisoning, yeah, I would usually capture it first, see if I can crack it, and if I can't crack it, move on to relays.
There's something that you mentioned, that the randomly generated password, unless pre-Windows 2000 is included.
Yes, that's a special case, but for that, you don't even have to do any of this because you know the password is going to be the same as the machine account name without the $sign. So that's why I separately like to run pre-2K, and I put that in your exploit instructions or proof of exploitation instructions. You can run pre-2K. Assuming you already have domain access, it'll pull down a list of machines, and then it'll try that against all of them. If you don't already have domain access, then you're going to have to somehow get a list of machine accounts, which again, like we talked about, you can do with that null SMB session if it's misconfigured, or potentially you can look at the machine name and generally the DNS name, right? And generally the machine account is named the same thing, but with a $sign at the end. Question.
So while capturing, right? First, I'll go one by one. Like first, I'll try responding. Okay. If that didn't work, I'll go try MITM6. If anyone did not work, I'll go to relay. Right?
So let's talk about on the left hand side, we have methods of coercion. On the top, we have things you can do with it. So when we're talking about trying to see what works. Methods of coercion, I'd go through the different methods and see if I get anything, right? If I'm able to capture something with LMNR, MDNS, NBNS poisoning, then I can also relay it, right? So it doesn't matter. I wouldn't necessarily try capture first, and if capturing doesn't work, try relay. Like if I can capture those creds, I can relay them. And if I can relay those creds, I can capture them. But yeah, if LMNR doesn't work, for example, then I try DHCPV6. If that doesn't work, maybe I try the unauthenticated petit podum. Does that answer that question? Yeah. So if you can capture, you can relay. If you can relay, you can capture. Because either way, you're receiving that authentication material.
But ideally, we need to follow the capture method first and then.
Yeah, so in most cases, it would make sense to capture first and then relay for various reasons. So when we're talking about these, you would capture first, because if you can crack the hash, that's the best case scenario. Whereas with these, you would capture it first to see if this even works in the first place, because it might be remediated.
Because machine accounts doesn't have, they get randomly generated passwords. That's why cracking doesn't.
Yeah, so for these, I wouldn't try cracking it, but I might still try capturing it just to see if it works.
Okay.
Yeah. Because, each of these can be remediated in a different way. I have like never in all my time with pen testing, I've never encountered a situation where all of those have been remediated on domain controllers. So just keep that in mind. Probably one's going to work, but in theory, yeah.
And like, how much time does it take for one particular command to execute, like to crack it, or like, is there any specific time or time consuming?
Yeah, so we're not actually talking about the cracking here. We're just talking about the commands you run to either capture the authentication material or relay it, right? So those commands, when you run them, they run instantly. How long you have to wait for the authentication material to come just depends. Like in LMNR poisoning, you're waiting for somebody to mistype something. So you could be waiting a long time, or it could come right away. DHCPv6 is generally okay. Yes and no. Usually instant, yes. But if you're doing it outside of active hours and there's nothing going on in the network, then of course you're not going to get DNS requests. But assuming you're doing this during work hours when people are actively using those machines, then yeah, DHCPv6 you will instantly know whether it works or not. So actually, when I run DHCPv6 and I don't receive anything, I know it's one of two cases. Either they remediated it, or I have to wait for like active hours because it's outside of active hours or nobody's using the network. So I'll leave it running, but I'll keep tabs on it because again, if it does work, you're going to be denying people access to other resources in the network. So you do have to keep tabs on it. But like if I don't get authentication immediately, I will like leave it running for a while and just monitor it back every so often.
What's the ideal time to run DHCPv6 spoofing? Well,
if it works, you run it until you're able to receive the authentication you need, and then you kill it immediately. Okay. If it is not working, or if you're not getting anything back, then you run it until you see that it is, right? Yeah. Make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
But also, we need to keep in mind that if we if we try running it for a long time, it might cause disturbance in that network.
Yeah. So it's only going to cause a disturbance if you see that it's giving you output, right? Like if you see that it's giving you output, it'll tell you when it does something. So if you don't see any output, it's not doing anything, so it's not disturbing anything, right? When it's doing stuff, it'll tell you like, oh, this IP address or this MAC address was assigned to this IP. And oh, we sent a fake response for this. So, yeah. So you can feel safe running it if you don't see anything happening. Just when you see things happening, kill it.
I'm gonna have to run and do rounds actually.
Oh yeah, RA stuff.
RA stuff. I gotta walk the floor of every floor in case it can count. Well, I looked at the itching real there. But I was thinking that takes about a half hour. I have to do it at some point in the next 2 hours. So
this is probably a good time to do it. Yeah.
I'll come back for services.
Makes sense. Yeah. Any more questions about this? Okay. We're going to add a piece to it in a second that's going to make it a little bit more complicated. But before we do that, let's talk about what you can do with relays. And this is available to you. This is available to you in our Google Drive. So if you go to Notes in Google Drive, you have Authenticate, which is what I just showed you, and Relay, which is what I'm showing you now. And again, I'm going to make this prettier and finish it because it's not quite done, but it's close. So where did I get this from? I did not come up with this. I got it from the hack recipes right here. However, there's a lot of unnecessary information here, and I don't like the way that this is presented, where they're like 1, 2, or 2 orange, right? So I got rid of the unnecessary side, which is client-side mitigation, and I gave you actual commands for the post-relay attacks. I took this, and the coercion methods, that's what we talked about just a second ago. There's way more than they put in this table. These are just a couple examples. But I took that and I made this. So there are 3 situations for the credential material that you receive. And this is why you would capture first. before you try relaying, because you'll know which situation you're dealing with. Because depending what situation you're dealing with defines what you can do with it. Situation 1 is you have an HTTP or a WebDAV hash. So remember, with this authentication material that you're receiving, it's either NetNTLM v1 or NetNTLM v2. In addition to that, it has a service that it's intended to go to, right? And that will show up in Responder when you capture it. It'll say SMB NetNTLM v2, for example. So if the service that it's intended for is HTTP or WebDAV, golden, you can relay it pretty much anywhere as long as there's no mitigation on the server side. The second scenario is if it's a NetNTLM v1, there you can relay it to more places than you could if it was HTTP or WebDAV. So let's say it's NetNTLM v1, but it's not HTTP, right? Let's say it's NetNTLM v1 and SMB. You can still do more things with it than if it were NetNTLM v2, but you can't do quite as many things as if it were HTTP. So as you can see with these bubbles, wherever I put this 2, that's where, if you get a NetNTLM v1 hash, you can relay it. But so as you can see, there are more places than with 3, but there are still some places where it doesn't apply. Make sense? And then the last case, which is worst case scenario, is you get a NetNTLM, but also most common, NetNTLM v2 hash that's intended for SMB. There is a caveat to this, where if you get NetNTLM v2 and there is a specific CVE that it could be vulnerable to, called drop the mic or drop the mic, I've heard it pronounced both ways. And if you want to exploit that, you would add -- remove mic or remove mic. And that would essentially, you can think of it as downgrading it to a NetNTLM v1. It wouldn't actually do that, but you can think of it that way. So if you're running, and both Responder and NTLM Relay X have separate flags to do this. So I'm showing the one for NTLM Relay X, remove mic, but Responder, I forget what it's called. It's called something different, but it does the same thing. So if you are seeing NetNTLM v2 SMB hashes, you could try to downgrade it and see if you're still receiving those hashes. And if you're still receiving those hashes, it's vulnerable. I never do that. So, because in modern environments, it's like very rare to see something that hasn't been patched for like a 2019 CVE. Especially since most of the hashes you're getting in the case of like poisoning and stuff are from users who are using their personal machines. So they'd have to be using like, I don't know, a Windows 7 or something. So I would just ignore this if you don't want to worry about it. But I just wanted to include it there for the sake of completeness. Make sense? Point is, HTTP WebDAV is a yay. That's why I put a happy, very happy face. NetNTLM v1 is still a yay, but a little bit less of a yay. So I put a happy face. And NetNTLM v2 SMB, I mean better than nothing, but I put a neutral face because, least happy for us as attackers. Cool. So those are the 3 different scenarios. Now let's talk about server-side mitigate. Let's talk about the target service here. So you're going to take whatever hash you are receiving. I'm calling it a hash, but authentication material that you are receiving. And in a report, I actually like to avoid saying hash and be like credential material or authentication material. Just putting that out there. You don't have to, but just to make it clear that it's not actually like an NTLM hash. But point is, there are kind of 3 main services that we can relay this to: HTTP, SMB, and LDAP. And for each of these, there are specific actions that we can do with it, right? So LDAP is the yay one. Like, we are happiest if we can relay to LDAP, because relaying to LDAP, you can dump information about the domain. Like, low privileged domain accounts, communicating to LDAP can get domain information, right? So you can get a list of users, list of computers, that kind of stuff, right? The second thing you can do is you can create a machine. You can create a machine account. Now, again, this depends on the machine account quota, which I think, was it Mohammed that did the, yeah. So that MSDS machine account quota defines how many they can create, but by default that's set to 10. And usually low privilege users are not creating machine accounts. So usually you can create a machine account if you're able to relay to LDAP, right? Other things you can do are configure shadow creds on the relayed account. So remember how we talked about RBCD or shadow creds? Both of those are baked into NTLM Relay X. So if you want to target the account that you're relaying and then compromise it potentially, you can run it with shadow creds that will add if they're using Active Directory certificate services in their domain and shadow creds works. Then you add basically a certificate that you can use to authenticate as that account. So normally, like when you're relaying and you relay to LDAP, let's say, you only have access to LDAP, right? You don't have access to everything in the domain as that user. But if you configure shadow creds on that account, you can use that certificate to request their NT hash, and then from there, you have access to everything as that user. So that's why LDAP is kind of like the win, LDAP or LDAP-S, because you can do all these cool things. Also, you can add a DNS record. So let's say, I don't know, I've never encountered a case where this is a thing, but if like LLM poisoning isn't working, but you were still able to get authentication material through some means, actually that's, yeah, so then you can add a DNS record for something that's non-existent, right? And maybe it'll authenticate to you that way. Again, don't worry about that because I've never encountered a scenario where it makes sense to do that, but just showing you your options.
Can you explain a little bit about shadow creds?
Yeah, so I know I've already explained this on the board, but I'm going to explain this time and time again because these are complex concepts and they apply in many different cases. But once you know it, you know it. And I want to make sure you know it well. This poor board. It's like covered in black now. Although this board is easy to erase, which is unusual. All right. We have two ideas. We have RBCD and we have shadow creds. Shadow creds can be used to compromise a user account or a machine account. We'll talk about why in a second, but just for now, user or machine, it doesn't matter. RBCD can only be used to compromise a machine account. Or to compromise a machine, I guess. Okay. However, shadow creds, even though it's more robust, it relies on AD certificate services. If they don't have an AD certificate services, shadow creds won't work. RBCD doesn't rely on that, but it relies on you having a machine account. So these are your prerequisites, these are your prerequisites, and this is what you gain control over as a result.
Can you put a relies on that so that we can, take a picture and remember it? RBCD relies on, so when we create
Yes, gotcha. Let's do this.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yes.
And then, let's word it this way. Instead of saying compromise, let's say target. Make sense?
Yes.
Cool. How do they actually work? they're both legitimate. Okay, so let's talk about shadow creds first. So when it comes to shadow creds, users have different ways of authenticating. They can authenticate with NTLM. They can authenticate with Kerberos. They can also authenticate with certificates. That's where shadow creds comes in. There's this special property on any account, user machine account, called MS. I think there's a dash. I always forget if there's that second dash or not. DS key credential link. If you're familiar with how public key cryptography works, there's a public key and a private key, right? So public key would go in here in the MSDS key credential link, which means if you have the private key, you can authenticate as that user or that machine, right? That's the legitimate use case for the MSDS key credential link. So in a shadow credentials attack, let's say you have control over that user machine. Or let's say you can control the properties of that user machine. Either there was a misconfigured ACL, right? Where then you can modify that, or you are that user or machine, right? Then you can control this property. If you can control this property, you can put any credential in there that you want. So you can throw in a credential just meaning like public key basically. And then you can use that to do things on behalf of the user machine account, right? So let's say you are relaying Bob's hash, or Bob's NTLM, net NTLM v2 authentication material. Probably not NTLM v1 since we're relaying the LTAP, but relaying Bob's authentication material, right? As Bob, I think about this. Yeah. As Bob, you can modify this MSDS key credential link on yourself. Makes sense? Because you are Bob, so if you want to authenticate with a certificate, sure. Like just add a credential there and then authenticate using that certificate instead, right? Makes sense, right? Like if you are Bob and you have Bob's password, why not enroll yourself in certificate authentication? Well, as an attacker, we can add a credential there, and then we can use that credential, basically, or that certificate, to then authenticate as Bob. Make sense?
Okay.
That's shadow creds.
Okay.
RBCD is that scenario where we were talking about before, but I just want to put them together, especially since we're going to be talking about RBCD in a bit here. It's this special scenario where, let's say, a user connects to a service, and that service then has to reach out to a second service on behalf of that user. So let's say this is web, this is database, which is the example I've been giving. A website needs to authenticate to the database on behalf of the user. So in this case, this is a machine account, a service account. This is also a service account. Remember, machine accounts are by definition service accounts. So that's why you must have a machine account. This is not entirely true because technically you need to have an account that has an SPN. SPN, or service principal name, is just what this makes it a service account, right? So if you have access to like a user account, but it's a server, it has an SPN, it's a service account, that works too. But the easiest way is just to have access to a machine account. Anyway, so that's the legitimate use case for RBCD. But as attackers, let's say in this case, we have Bob is maybe a bad example, but let's say Bob's a machine, right? And remember, a machine is a service. So in this case, this is Bob. This is Bob, and we want to have access to Bob, the machine, right? In this case, what we're going to do is we need some SVC1, or in this case, we can, if we're already on the domain, we can create a machine account, right? Assuming that MSDS machine account quota is 10 or whatever. So let's say we create a machine account called Cyberhawks, which also, when you're in the environment, actually don't use Cyberhawks, use team and then your team number. But let's say we created a machine account called Cyberhawks. Now what we can do, we have control over Cyberhawks because we created it. We configure Bob. We configure Bob to allow Cyberhawks to delegate to Bob or to request these service tickets to Bob, right? And then from there, since we have control over Cyberhawks, then we can request service tickets to Bob on behalf of any user. So for example, if Bob's a machine, right, we could log in as the administrator. We can say, I want a service ticket on behalf of admin, administrator, or some domain admin, right, to the, I don't know, like to the CIFS service on Bob, and then we can list files on Bob. Make sense? That's RBCD. So shadow creds, RBCD.
Okay. To configure Bob, this is controlled by the MSDS allowed to act on behalf of other.
Correct. Just like this is MSDS credential link, this is MSDS allowed to act on behalf of other identity.
Okay, so if we have a password for one of the accounts, right? In Shadowcreds, we can request certificates on behalf of that account.
Yeah.
And after that, we use Cyberhawks to request, let's say,
these are two separate ideas.
Okay.
You're either doing RBCD or you're doing shadow creds.
Okay. Then it's fine.
Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. These are your two choices. And which one you use depends on the scenario. If you have a machine account and you're targeting a machine, RBCD. If they have ADCS in their environment, I would just use shadow creds. Because you get it. And then, okay, let's say in this case, so we talked about Bob being the user, it made sense, now we can log in as the user, right? Let's say Bob is a machine, but we want to use shadow creds, right? And we want to get on the machine itself. If you have, this will give you the machine account hash, right, in the end, or Bob's hash. But that's not super helpful for logging into Bob, right? You can't log into a machine with the machine account. So that's where you have to do, that's where step 2 would be an S4U2 self. If it's a machine account. If machine S4U2 self, with that machine account, you can request service tickets on behalf of users to yourself, right? Because if you have a machine account, you are the machine, right? The machine has to be able to request service tickets for users to itself. So at that point, you can use an S4U2 self, which you do with Rubius S4U, with the /self flag, and then you can request a service ticket on behalf of a domain admin to that machine and then log into that machine. You basically did the same thing here. You also did Rubius S4U. The only difference is here, that was the only thing you could do. You didn't get the machine account hash or anything. You can only request service tickets. Whereas here, you got the machine account hash and then you have to request service tickets.
Okay, so the second case is only possible if MSDS key credential link is there on.
Yeah, so this attribute always exists in Active Directory. It can only be used if they have ADCS.
Okay.
And you have to add a credential here.
A credential as in password, then to get a ADCS certificate for the Bob.
So, when you add something here, you're not getting a certificate, you are creating one.
Okay.
You create the certificate, which is a public and private key pair. You throw the public key in there in this attribute, and then you can use the private key from that certificate that you created. Private key, also known as certificate, I think. I might be using these words like technically incorrect, but like once you have the public key in here, you use that certificate, which I believe is the private key, to then authenticate. Make sense? That does not make sense. Let me explain it again. This attribute exists on all objects in Active Directory, users and computers. If you have control over this attribute, which is one of two cases, either there's a misconfigured ACL, like in Bloodhound, right? Misconfigured ACL. Option 2 is that you are that user, and then you have control over this for yourself, right? What you can do is you can create a credential locally on your machine, upload the public key here, and then use it to authenticate as that user. And so, once you have that certificate, or that credential, right, you can do anything you want as that user, including request its NT hash. So if we look at the full attack chain, step 1 would be modify, I'll just say key credential link. Step 2 is using that certificate, request, you can either request the NT hash or you can request a TGT, it doesn't matter which. NT hash or TGT, either one. And then the third thing, once you have the NT hash or the TGT, then you can do S4U2 self.
If it's a machine, to get a hash.
If it's a machine, to get access to the machine itself, right? Yeah. So you already own the machine account, but to actually get on the machine, that's where you do an S4U2 self.
You already have a machine account access. Then why do we have to?
Because machine accounts do not have access to the machine itself. Machine accounts are the accounts used to run services on that machine.
Okay.
Yeah. But you can't like RDP into a machine with a machine account.
Yes.
Yeah. If you wanted to RDP into a machine, you'd have to request a service ticket on behalf of a user to RDP into that machine.
So it doesn't make sense to get NT hash, right? Because
in this case, yeah, you could get the TGT. You could just get the TGT and then use the TGT to do S4U2 self. Yes. Correct. If you had a user, it would probably make more sense to get the NT hash, because NT hashes are easier to work with tools than having to use a TGT.
What's the vulnerability linked to being able to modify an SDSK credential?
Depends on the situation. If it's ACL abuse, right? Like let's say you are already on the domain and you can modify somebody else's MSDS key credential link. That is in the way we wrote it. I think it's like excessive privileges on domain object or excessive privileges on domain object ACL, right? And that you would find in Bloodhound. That's one scenario. The other scenario, which we're talking about here, is relays. If you were able to obtain credential material, relay it to modify this, it depends how you obtain the credential material in the first place. So if you got it through poison, like LMNR poisoning, then the vulnerability is LMNR enabled. But this will be part of your attack path.
Okay. But by default, and the normal thing is that key credential link is always going to be a modifiable attribute.
Yeah, it's not modified by other users by default, right?
By that user, it's normal to be able to do.
But I believe, I want to say it's normal for the user to be able to modify its own MSDS key credential. I should know that for a fact, but I'm just thinking about like doing a DC to DC relay and then modify it using shadow creds. Yeah. So based on what I've done in the past, yes. I would say yes. Questions about these two?
Can you repeat it again once again?
What I just said.
Yes.
I have to think about what I just said. A user can modify its own MSDST credentialing property, and other, like admins, for example, or users who are explicitly given permissions, can also modify this for a user. But by default, anybody else cannot modify this, right? And so a vulnerability might be, let's say you could modify this on another user, and you're not an admin. That's a vulnerability, and our nomenclature for that is excessive privileges on domain object, or excessive privileges on domain object ACL. And that you would find in Bloodhound.
Okay.
But if you're relaying, right, if you initially got authentication material for Bob, and you relayed to LDAP, and you configured shadow creds for Bob, that itself is not a vulnerability because Bob has access to his own key credentialing, right? But the fact that you could get that authentication material in the first place is the vulnerability. So if you got it through LMNR poisoning, the vulnerability is LMNR enabled.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool. I know I talk really loud, so sorry guys. I'm just a loud person. This stuff excites me, so. Also, I'm trying to get the recording to hear me, so if you watch this later, you can hear what I was talking about. Okay, cool. Anyway.
We need to figure out like a plan between me and him so that we don't step on each other's foot and we're not doing
Yeah,
the
that's
same.
true.
So yeah, we'll talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, you did most of the ADCS stuff,
Yeah, so
but you
I was
did most
thinking-
of the relay stuff.
Really,
So I think it would make sense if there's anything non-relay that's ADCS that you do it, whereas if it's relays and there is some like overlap, that you probably do it. Or if it's ESC8, which I think you wrote up, you can talk to each other because that usually involves a relay, but it's ESC8. So.
And then for the first steps, maybe I can try LMNR and DNS, and you can try MITM6, and
Sure.
can do both
Yeah.
at the same time. Whoever gets their
Yeah.
credentials first, or whatever.
I would be careful also doing both at the same time. Well, I'm thinking you're going to be doing it on different machines, so this might not actually make a difference. But sometimes I run both at once because I'm like, I just need to, if I want to compromise, if I'm on a time crunch and I'm like, I want to get a domain admin in like the first 30 minutes, I'll run both at once. And then wherever I get the authentication material from, doesn't matter, I got it. But then it's a lot harder for reporting because then you have to go back and you have to figure out, okay, I received this authentication from 10.1.3.5. Is that, now I have to go back in my LMNR logs. Was that poisoned or was it in MITM6?
So what if we get the same account or user credentials on MITM6?
This is, you don't have to worry about it if you're running them separately. This is just because if you're running them together.
We can try to crack it. If it's cracked, cool. If it's not, then we can relay it. And depends on the situation. I'll either take care of it or you do. It depends on which one. But I have the longest question, so sorry about this.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so I want to have a comprehensive list of vulnerabilities on Active Directory. So let's say, for example, I capture an authentication material.
Oh, interesting.
And
I stand corrected.
MSDS.
Elevated privileges. Huh.
No, by default, no. Huh.
I take back all of the things that I previously said. I'm interested, though, then why relaying from one DC to another works with shadow creds. Maybe a DC machine accounts tab? Interesting. I'll have to look into that. Now we know. Anyway, continue. You were saying?
Yeah, okay. So I was saying, I try to, I capture some authentication material, and I'm able to crack some of them, and some of them cannot be cracked.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So since I want to have a comprehensive list of vulnerabilities, obviously if it's cracked, then okay, done for that. I don't have to relay those authentication material. The ones that I captured and could not be cracked, should I still move on and say, okay, for these I relayed them? And
you don't have to bother relaying them. If you achieved your goal, Because what are the vulnerabilities associated with it? If they can be cracked, then you have weaker default password or weak password windows, right? Or weak password Active Directory. I forget what we called it. If it can't be cracked, no vulnerability associated with it, you don't have to try relaying, because the only reason you would relay is to maybe check. Is to check if there may be, the other reason you might relay is to check for server-side mitigations, right? But there are other ways to check for it without relaying. So we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, you wouldn't have to relay it.
Because I'm thinking on the patching side, let's say I was able to crack some passwords, some hashes, sorry, and then the recommendation for that, okay, use stronger passwords and do this and this and this and this. But then if they patch that, and then on a different scenario, they already patched that, but I'm able to relay those authentication material, and I'm able to get domain admin through relaying in a different scenario. But that would be also vulnerability. Like that would be also.
But it doesn't make sense, right? If we crack the password.
I know. For our goal is to get domain access.
Okay.
But for their goal is to have everything patched, everything fixed on their side.
Right. Okay. But once you're on the domain, you can see what privileges other domain users have, right? Or what you can see what ACLs or what permissions in Bloodhound. You can go and look. And so if that other user doesn't have any excessive ACLs in Bloodhound, you know there's no point in relaying. If they do, you can relay, but you can also just point out that you saw it in Bloodhound that they have excessive permissions.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. Design flaws and trust assumptions.
Honestly, I think that they're gonna put some very weak passwords in there, because the whole point is like to make them. I'm assuming they're gonna make themselves somewhat vulnerable, and so I think we'll be able to just. So my question is
Okay, I learned something today. I didn't know this. So when we said that users can modify their own MSDS key credential link property, only machine accounts can. So user accounts cannot, machine accounts can. Yeah. So if this were like an ACL abuse scenario, like it still comes into like you could still, if it's ACL abuse, then you were explicitly given permissions to modify it, so you could still take over a user account that way, right? But if we're relaying, shadow creds, I guess, will only work for machine accounts, which I didn't know. Now I know.
So no anti-hash, only TGT.
You can get either, but yeah.
For machine accounts.
Sure, if you want to, you can get the TGT and then do S4U2 self using the TGT to get on the machine.
Okay.
Yes. Correct. Machine accounts to this. I didn't know that. That's interesting. This is to allow legitimate processes like setting up device certificates. Yeah, I mean, makes sense. Cool.
So we have two attack paths. One MSDS machine account code and this ADCS, right?
That's if we couldn't crack those methods, because it wouldn't be necessary to even create an account to try to do all that.
But so MSDS machine account code is quite easy.
Right, that is true. Like if I was able to crack the hashes and everything, I just wanted to add some vulnerabilities in there for them. Should I just like run that command, get a Active Directory object, whatever, to see like what the MSDS machine account quota is, and say like this is a separate like scenario, even though I didn't exploit it.
Sorry. Start from the beginning. I missed the very beginning of that.
Okay. I ran. I was able to crack some hashes after like setting up responder for LMNR or NTLS or whatever. Then at this point, I don't even need to exploit MSDS
shadow creds,
shadow creds or MSDS machine account quota greater than 0. Right.
Right. Okay. Yes. Sure.
So, should I just
to try
additional? I don't know, for additional vulnerability, because I can just run the get command to see what the MSDS machine account quota is with one command very easily. Oh no, actually no, I took that back. You have to be on the.
You have to be on the domain to see the MSDS machine account quota. Yeah. Mhm.
But if we crack those hashes and we get to the domain with that password that we cracked, then we can look for some things that are not going to be too much time consuming, such as MSTS machine account quota. I can see that and then put it on the report as well, just to
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
But we won't do like relaying and stuff like that. We just like check whether these attributes are default or not.
Sorry. So if we got a domain access using domain user authenticated, if we got a hash of an authenticated user on the domain, right? I'll just try to use the certify to look for all the vulnerable templates and try to make an attack path. That can also work, right?
Yeah. Sure. If they have ESC1 or ESC4 or ESC6, if they have ESC8, you might not even have to do that because you might be able to relay.
But the plus side of ESC8 is we directly get privileged access, right?
In most cases, yeah. Unless they have EPA enabled. But we'll talk about that right now. All right. Okay. Lots of questions. These are great questions, by the way. I love the questions. But I also want to make sure we're not like here until 10 p.m. Yeah. So, okay. The second thing we have to worry about. So we have this auth type that we have to worry about first of all, because that defines what we can do. Right. I was talking about the services. So then we have the service that we're targeting, right? And depending on what service we target, we can do different things with it. So LDAP is a yay because we can do all these things. If we have a computer account specifically, and I will actually move shadow creds now to the computer account section now that I know that. There we go. Boop. Boop.
I'm gonna try pushing this to GitHub just in case. If they,
yeah,
if
go
they don't
for
say
it.
anything about it, then
yeah, right.
we have it.
Okay, so if you have a computer account, you can configure RBCD or shadow creds to then gain access to that machine, right? Or to gain access to that machine, or to gain initial access to the domain. Let's say you were able to capture a computer account for whatever, you can relay it for whatever reason. You can relay it to LDAP. You configure shadow credentials. You get the NTLM hash machine account. Doesn't matter. You can use that to authenticate now as the machine. Okay. The third thing you can do is if you're very lucky and you happen to relay a privileged account like a domain admin or something, it will automatically, even if you don't specify anything, it will create a new domain admin. Unless you specifically say --no-da, there's a flag to stop it from doing that. But by default, if you don't include anything, it'll try to create a domain admin. And if it can, it'll give you the creds, I believe, to the domain admin. I've never actually done that because that's never been the case. But for me, I'd assume that's how that works. Now, this is why we recommend, as security professionals, we're like, do not use domain admin accounts to do daily business operations. Domain admin accounts should only be used for privileged, sensitive operations that require domain admin permissions. And that's why if you're looking at an enterprise network, you're going to see like a separate somebody, like let's say there's a guy named Mike. He'll have a separate low privilege Mike account and a separate domain admin Mike account. Because we want to use those domain admin accounts as little as possible. So if we can grab that authentication material, it can't be relayed to do things like this. Among other things, like if you use, like we talked about, if you jump on a machine, there will be, and you try to dump, for example, LSA, or I think it's LSA, and you can see the hashes for domain users who are logged in, or like you dump, let's say you dump LSAS memory, you see the hashes for users who are logged in. You don't want privileged domain accounts in there, as little as possible, ideally. And what though I say LSAS, the way I would usually do that is I would just dump Kerberos tickets, because that is less likely to be killed by an EDR if you dump Kerberos tickets, in my experience.
So the worst case for a domain admin, best case for an attacker, is if they use their domain account during business hours and they mistype something.
Yeah, if they use their domain admin
their
account.
Password,
yeah.
And their password is weak.
And their well, if their password is weak, if you're very lucky, you don't even have to do this relaying.
Yeah.
You can just crack it. Yeah. Okay. The other two places you can relay are HTTP and SMB. HTTP, when we talk about HTTP, we're usually referring to the web enrollment portal on ADCS. Which, if there is a web enrollment portal on ADCS, you can, and EPA is not enabled, you can do S-Gate, or in other words, you can basically request a certificate for that account. And so you would relay to the ADCS web enrollment portal, request a certificate, and now you can log in using that account. Because with that certificate, you can request their NT hash, you can request a TGT, doesn't matter. So that's the biggest thing. You can also use ESC1 and ESC6 with relays, but I can't think of a scenario where it would make sense to do that. Because in most cases, I would just abuse ESC8, and then I gain access as that user anyway, and then I can then run ESC1 or ESC6 if I want. So, yeah.
I have a doubt here.
Mm-hmm.
So if certificate authority itself is vulnerable to ESC1 or ESC8, ESC1.
Correction, certificate authorities are never vulnerable to ESC1.
Sorry, ESC8.
Yes. ESC1 is a certificate template can be vulnerable to ESC1. Yeah.
If certificate authority is vulnerable to ESC8.
Yeah. So what ESC8 means, the only thing it means is that they're using web enrollment. And if they're using web enrollment, you can use ESC8. So yes, so if they're using web enrollment, you can relay to that web portal, right? Because that web portal is going to be using HTTP or HTTPS.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, you can request a certificate for that user.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you request a certificate for that user, you can log in as that user.
Okay.
So if you didn't have domain access, let's say you did your LLM&R poisoning, you relayed the authentication material to the web enrollment portal, you requested a certificate, now you can authenticate as that user as many times as you want, doesn't matter, right? The second case where we do this is, let's say you have a net NTLM v1, right? Notice that, is this supposed to be here? This is not supposed to be here. Sorry, guys. 1 and 2, not 3. I forgot to get rid of it. And I'm going to go and double check these so that I make sure they're right. But, or actually, yeah, 1 and 2. So 1 and 2. There we go. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Okay, so let's say you have a net NTLM v1 hash, or you have an HTTP or WebDAV hash. Sorry. Okay. Let's say you coerce a domain controller, right? This is where things start getting interesting. Going back to our table, where is my table? Not that. Okay. Going back to our table, if we can coerce a domain controller to authenticate back to us, oh my gosh. And from there, we can relay to the web enrollment portal as that domain controller. Also, I was right. I'm just second guessing myself. If we can relay to the web enrollment portal as that domain controller, we can get a certificate for that domain controller. And then we have control over that domain controller account and can do a DC sync.
Yes.
So that's the second scenario where ESC8 applies.
One more question. Okay. So if we get a hold of domain account, right? The first thing we'll do is DC sync in any case. A domain controller account.
Yes.
The first thing we'll do is DC sync.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing else you really can do with a domain controller account. You could log into the domain controller. You could do an S4U2 self. Log into the domain controller. There's no point in doing that if you can just DC sync, get all the password hashes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The third place that you can relay to, if neither of these are a viable option, is SMB.
But how does
So if you relay to SMB, I didn't finish writing out the commands here, but basically the things you can do as anyone is you can enumerate accounts. You can create an account if you're relaying to a domain controller. Again, signing is usually required. We'll talk about this in a second on domain controller, so that it will very rarely be the case. But you could like create a machine account similar to how you could with LDAP, right, over SMB. And if you're lucky enough to relay to a target where you are a local admin, you can additionally run commands, or you can dump creds. Of course, credential dumping will likely get caught by EDR, so a lot of times you won't be able to dump creds, but you'll, at the very least, in a lot of cases, be able to run commands. And on older machines, like in the CPTC, where they probably won't put you against EDR and antivirus, they would dump creds if you're a local admin by default. Okay, so that's what you can do. This is what you get. This is what you can do with it, right? Now, what stops you from there's one additional thing that could stop you from doing this, and that's the server-side mitigation. So, with each of these, and this is the official fix to the vulnerability too. Yeah. You missed us going through shadow creds and RBCD one more time. I know. But you didn't miss anything here, so yeah. It is still a work in progress, but it's getting there. So the server, so how do we actually prevent this? Well, there's something called signing or EPA, depending on the service, right? Sometimes EPA for LDAP is called channel binding, because the underlying mechanism that EPA uses on LDAP secure is channel binding. But just signing, channel binding, EPA, you can think of them as essentially the same thing. They block this from happening. If EPA is required for HTTPS, you can't relay. If signing is required for SMB, you can't relay. If signing is required for LDAP, you can't relay, right? On the server side, so it depends who you're relaying to. The computer that you're relaying to, if it requires signing, you can't relay to it. Make sense? Mm-hmm. There are other configuration options like enabled but not required that still allow you to relay, right? And depending for HTTPS, it depends whether it's fully disabled or whether it's enabled but not required, right? It gives you different options of what you can do.
But administrators have, by default, they have signing enabled, right?
Computers, I don't remember which ones do and which ones don't. Domain controllers, by default, I think have signing required. But a lot of machine accounts, I don't want to misspeak, but a lot of machine accounts are going to have signing is enabled but not required. Yeah. And so these things you can actually check for in certain cases. So, and normally, okay, let's say I find an ADCS endpoint and I'm relaying to it. I'm probably not going to bother checking this. I'm probably just going to try relaying to it. If it's HTTP, you don't even have to check, right? You can just relay. But for these, I might check before I try to relay to figure out whether it's even worth it. So for LDAP and LDAP-S, as a low-privileged domain account, you can check whether domain controllers require signing and channel binding, right? If you are not authenticated, you can check for LDAP channel binding, or EPA, I guess, on LDAP-S, but you can't check for signing on LDAP. And I'm going to put the commands like right here too, so you have them. I just haven't gotten to that yet. So if I see that I have a net NTLM v1 hash, I'm going to be like, ooh, that's fun. I can relay it to hopefully LDAP or LDAP-S, right? The first thing I do is I check if LDAP-S requires channel binding or EPA, right? And if it's required, well, then I can't relay to LDAP-S. I'll at least try relaying to LDAP. But if it says not required or set to never, then I'll just relay to LDAP-S. Make sense? This is where it starts getting confusing, but hopefully having the diagram Makes it a lot easier. For SMB, same thing. I'm not even going to bother relaying to SMB. You don't have to have credentials at all to check whether signing is required or not. You can just do it with Nmap. There's an Nmap script, SMB2 security mode. Check if signing is required. If it's required, it's not a relay target. But if it's not required, it is a relay target. And remember, that's also going to go in the report. Signing not required. It goes in the report. Yeah, or LDAP signing, channel binding not required, goes in the report. So
we can't check if signing is required or not required for LDAP, but we can check for LDAP.
Correct. Unless you have domain, unless you're already on the domain. If you're already on the domain, you can check both.
Okay.
So unauthenticated with no credentials, you can check LDAP-S, but not LDAP. If you have credentials for a domain user, you can check both.
Okay. I know this might take a little bit of time, so I understand if we don't have time for this, but can we see a quick demo for a relay example?
Oh yeah, we sure can. Okay. So let's do this. I was planning on it. Don't you worry. We just spent a lot of time talking about that stuff, but we're going to demo it. Okay, so I'm not on the domain yet. I want to get on the domain, right? Let's go back here. Let's see what options we have. These are our options, right? Unauthenticated, we want to get on the domain. These are our options. So let's try poisoning and see what we get. So first, let's do poisoning and capture just to see what we're receiving before we do any relays or anything like that, right? Okay. So responder-I eth0w. I put eth0 because if you use Kali by default, it's going to be eth0, but because this is just a regular Debian machine, I actually have to look at the interface name, which is not eth0, but it's ENS18. And you have to be root to run this. And if you're doing this in Kali Linux, you don't have to bother like saying python responder.py. You will just run sudo responder. Okay. Done. Maybe I should add sudo to those commands, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. But oh, whoops. Oh, yeah, I'm in the right spot. And responder. And this one I kind of already demoed, so this is probably a review. Responder.py -I ENS18-W. And I'm probably already running it somewhere else because it's giving me
already 2 vulnerabilities.
Yes. So already a vulnerability. We saw this.
3 actually.
Yep, you're correct. NBTNS, MDNS, LMNR, they all go in.
Yes.
Also, I'm guessing I'm already running it in the background somewhere, so that's going to be super annoying because now I have to do netstat. Sorry. Yes, netstat -int up. Am I blanking? Once. And I want to sudo it. Actually, I am root, so that should be fine. It doesn't have netstat, so we do ss. We get the process ID of one of these, like 80, which should definitely not be running. Or 88, sure. 3579. Kill. 33579. Let's see if that fixed it. That fixed it. Okay. Now we can run responder. Beautiful. And again, like we got authentication before, but we're not seeing it now, so you might have to wait a little bit. Might only happen periodically. So there you go. And oh my god, my demo actually worked.
Yes. And we are lucky we got web dev.
How did it?
We can relay.
I didn't change anything. I swear. I set this up a long time ago and it just wasn't working in the past couple demos, and it just my heart. Okay. So first thing I would try to do is I would try to crack this, which I already showed in a previous demo, but I would basically copy this, put it in a file called hash.txt, and then I'd run hashcat-m5600 hash.txt word list. So rock you.
Let's assume it's a strong password.
Let's assume it's a strong password. You can't crack it. All right, let's see what we got. We got webdev and NTLM v2. So going back to our relays, we have webdev, so we are very, very happy. So we can relay it pretty much anywhere. So if we can relay it pretty much anywhere, my ideal target would be LDAP, and I can at least like dump domain info and stuff like that, right? So let's check if LDAP signing is required, so we know right away whether we can use LDAP-S or not. So to do that, I'm just going to do this on my Kali machine because it doesn't matter. netexec, LDAP, and I don't, the target, so I have to get a list of DCs. So this is where, I think I did this in a previous lecture, but in case I didn't, DNS recon -d cptc.local, and I've actually, you can save it to a file. I forget what the flag is, but I just figured out, I always thought you had to save it to an XML file, and then I'm like, oh wait, it supports other file formats too. Also, so now we know what the domain controllers are, right? So we have 10, 11, and those look like the only ones. So I'll put those in a file. 192.168.12.10, 192.168.12.11, just so that I have them, right? And now I'm going to run netexec LDAP DC's IP.text, and then the module I'll use is LDAP checker. And hopefully that works. And it actually didn't, maybe I have to explicitly specify, let's try this. Let's try null session. Whoops, I put it in the wrong spot. Sorry guys. -u, -p. I feel like this has worked for me before. Huh. So it says bind failed, which is interesting. So I guess it's not even looking at LDAP-S. Weird. Oh well, we can try relaying it. So if I get something like this and I'm like, well, it's not even telling me, I should be able to ideally enumerate LDAP-S, but for some reason it's not doing that. I might be doing something wrong. Oh, maybe I have to actually say LDAP-S. I don't think it's different though. Whatever, I'll look into it. I wanted to demo this. -m checker options. Okay, that's what I figured. Weird. Well, we can always try it, right? If that works, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So, how are we going to do this now? We still want to do LMNR poisoning, but this time instead of capture, we want to relay. So here's what we got. We have NTLM relay X, which we're going to run first, and then we're going to run responder. So both of these need to be run on the jump box, right? Because I need to be in the network to do this. So I'm going to grab a second session to that jump box, just so I have them both. And before we actually run NTLM relay X, let's figure out what flags we need to do to carry this attack out. So if I go here, it looks like if I want to dump the domain, I don't really need any additional flags, but I also mentioned that you could do dump ADCS, dump laps, and dump GMSA to dump some additional things. So I'll add those in too. So going back, combining those, so this plus this is going to be NTLM relay x.py -target. What's my target? My target is LDAP or LDAP-S. I wasn't able to figure out whether it would work, so it doesn't matter which one we try. We'll just try one, hope it works. LDAP, and then the domain controller, which can either be IP address or domain name. I like to do domain name. So remember, we did get that from DNS Recon. I just didn't write it down, but DC1. So we'll try DC1 cptc.local. And then we'll include these just for the fun of it. Because otherwise, by default, it'll just dump like domain user information. But this way, you can also get like the ADCS information, which may be helpful for us. So let's see what we get. So this is the first thing I'm going to run. And the second thing I'm going to run, if you remember, going back to our thing here, the second thing I'm going to run is responder again. But I have to run it second rather than first. So I'm going to set this up. So that's already running. I did not test this in advance, so hopefully my demos work because that'd be awesome. And then we're going to rerun responder. And as you notice, it failed to start on 80 and 445. Why? Because NTLM Relay X is picking that up. And hopefully we'll get that authentication again, but now it's just a waiting game, right? And you'll see that poisoned text here, and right after that, you'll see it pop up here. And watch, now that I started this, it'll decide not to work anymore because that's how it goes. But ideally, once that's running, once we get that authentication, it might take a bit, but we'll relay to LDAP-S or LDAP. So as you can see, we got this here, and at the same time, we got it received a connection. However, this time it was an SMB hash for whatever forsaken reason. I have no clue why. Last time it was a WebDAV hash. There we go. Now we got a WebDAV hash, looks like. So, looks like we authenticated, as you can see, as RPi. And then I'm not seeing enumerated relayed user privileges. Yeah, fine. Attempting to dump lapse passwords. That failed. That's fine because we're not using lapse. Why is my demo not working? You're unfortunately just going to have to take my word for it. I probably just set something up incorrectly. But in most cases, you would get this message. It would say, attempting to dump lapse password. That might fail if they're not using lapse. But then it'll dump ADCS, and you'll be able to see the ADCS information. And I'll just try that. I'll try removing this and seeing if I can just do dump ADCS, and maybe we'll get different results. Also, another thing, if you're relaying to LDAP, and I'm not sure if I wrote this here. If you're catching an HTTP or WebDAV hash and relaying to LDAP, for example, and you don't want to like catch SMB hashes because those aren't helpful to you, you can additionally say -- no SMB server did not start the SMB server. Again, if you don't remember that, not a big deal. And we'll see if that gives us any different results, but may not. There we go. Okay, I guess for some reason it was lapse was failing, and so it didn't continue. But now it worked. So maybe play around with the flags a bit, but I got it to work with just dump ADCS. And so as you can see now, we have all ADCS enrollment info. So we can see that there's an ADCS enrollment service here, right? And it tells us the certificate authority, and it also tells us all the certificates that we can enroll in and who has permissions to enroll in those, right? In addition, it should have dumped domain info, right? So it says dumping domain info for the first time. And now if I kill NTLM Relay X, and I'll kill this too, and take a look at what it actually did. Look at this. We have domain computers, domain groups, domain policy, domain trusts, domain users, right? And so what this is actually doing under the hood is it's running another tool called LDAP domain dump, which you could run yourself in Kali Linux. It comes built in. So if I just run LDAP domain dump with the user's creds, it would give me these exact same files, right? So from here, I can, for example, see all the domain users by group right here. So if I download this, refresh, domain users by group, download, and we'll just download it to downloads. Boop. And open it up in a web browser. My computer is now frozen because it does that. Oh, hello.
Guys, sorry I have to leave.
That's totally fine.
I I don't have the public transport after 7 as it's weekend, right? Saturday, Sunday. So
You live in the suburbs, right?
yeah, this planes.
Des Plaines?
Yeah, so 240 won't come after 6:50.
I can probably give you a ride back. I'm in Deerfield, which isn't.
Where?
I'm in Deerfield.
It's far.
It is a bit of ways, though, I think.
It's gonna be far. It's a different.
Maybe you're right.
Yeah.
Des Plaines. Let's see.
That's why I took 2 trains and 2 buses.
Yeah, that's commitment.
Yeah.
Wait, let's see. Directions.
No, I'll see the recording of the rest part.
Yeah, for sure.
And
That works too.
For the services.
yeah, services. And it's not tough for me. So
Sounds good. We can do it that way. Oh my gosh.
Is everyone else good to stay?
Yes.
Otherwise, we could switch to the other side of things if people are not good to stay. But
No.
Okay, so done.
I'm okay with it.
Yeah. Is everybody
guys okay?
cool to stay? Like,
Yes, see.
are you cool to stay?
Are you-
Most importantly.
yeah.
Another hour.
yeah,
Okay.
totally.
All right.
Sorry
see you.
for the.
No, no worries.
That's
no worries.
totally fine. I'm glad
Thank
you
you
came.
for-
I appreciate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, is everyone good to stay another, especially another hour? No.
So opening domain users by group.
You're staying.
This is how you should say it.
Opening domain users by group in a web browser, right? We have all the domain users, right?
Wow.
And guess what? We can see the descriptions for the domain users. So I think I had like a password and a description here somewhere. Yep, see? Password. Boom. Now we just basically compromise the K-Star user, right?
Another vulnerability. Clear text.
Clear text,
Clear text.
Yep. sensitive information, and object descriptions or whatever it was. Yeah.
Yeah, we got this.
You're connecting the dots. I
Yes.
love it. All right. So cool. So we got our domain info, but the other thing we got that's interesting is look, we have ADCS enrollment info. So we have this certificate authority here. So let's see if it's like accessible over HTTP, right? We'll just throw it in a web browser. So it looks like it is accessible over HTTP. And the actual path for ADCS is if you go to /cert srv or cert serve, it takes you to the
Okay. It gives the.
Yeah. And if HTTP doesn't work, just try HTTPS. Maybe that'll work.
No.
Advanced.
You can hit that.
And there you go. And you should see it requesting credentials, right? So this means because they have web enrollment enabled, we can actually relay to the web enrollment portal, right? And grab a credential or grab a certificate, I should say, not a credential, a certificate for that user, right? So in order to do that, so taking a look at this, we just relayed here, right? With a web dev, we can relay pretty much anywhere. So we can also relay to the web enrollment portal and exploit ADCS S8, right? So to do that, we just run NTLM relayX the same way again, but this time we're going to do --ADCS and then --template and then specify what template we want to enroll in, right? Because everything in ADCS, there are templates for certificates that you can request. And those define what permissions that certificate has and who can enroll in it, right? So if I go back here, let's see. So it looks like we can enroll in domain users can enroll in this user template. And this is explicitly specifying templates that allow for client authentication and don't require manager approval. And the reason it's calling these out is because that means if we enroll in it, we can then use that certificate that we get to authenticate as the user, right? It allows for client authentication. Make sense? Okay, so we can just use that user template. So we'll rerun NTLM relayX. This time, instead of relaying to LDAP, we'll relay to HTTPS, the web enrollment portal. And we can just copy this path right here, actually. Sometimes you can't just specify cert serve. Sometimes you have to do cert serve /cert finish or whatever the full URL is that I don't remember off the top of my head. But You can always verify this in a web browser. If it asks you to enter creds, then it should work. Point is, we do that. --ADCS -- template user, correct. Boom. Now we run this again. And we wait. Hopefully we get that hash again. Hopefully we can relay it to the web enrollment portal and do that. Another thing I could have done that maybe would have been worth it, I just didn't think about it, is remember when we initially relayed to LDAP, we could also create a computer account or create a machine account, right? So I could have already tried to do that right off the bat. I could have added add computer to my initial thing, and then I would have already had initial access to the domain. But it's fine, you know, this should work too. So that's fine. This is our SMB one. For some reason, we're catching it over SMB and WebDAV. So there's our WebDAV one. Boom. I'll kill it now that it's done. As you can see, it authenticated successfully. It got a certificate and saved it to our pi.pfx. Keep this output. One, it's going in your report, and two, see how it says ID? That needs to be revoked. That certificate is actually valid in their ADCS environment. So it will need to be revoked or cleaned up at the end of the test. So if you're able to get domain admin, you can revoke it yourself through MMC. If you don't get domain admin, I'll show you how to do that in a second. If you don't get domain admin, then you have to let the client know, here's the certificate, here's the ID, this certificate can be revoked. Makes sense? Every change you make. Also, if you created a machine account, the machine account would have to be removed. Same idea. Okay.
I should be able to copy and paste into Sysraptor if it's in the same machine, right? The way you do, like, take that and copy and paste it for the output.
Yeah.
Better than screenshots.
There are two approaches. You can either take a screenshot or you can copy and paste. Why do I copy and paste? Two reasons. Reason number one is, let's say you're delivering this report to a client and they're using an online version of that report, like they're looking at the PDF online. It would be really nice for them to be able to copy and paste the commands that you ran. And if you put it as an image, they can't copy and paste the commands you ran. But if you put it in as a code block, they can copy and paste those themselves, and then they can try what you did, which is especially useful if they're double checking like domain findings with Active Directory PowerShell. That's reason number one. Reason number two is if the command is really long. Do you see all this? This is irrelevant to what actually happened, right? This is just telling you that it's starting these servers. So you can truncate. And the way I do that, if you look at my proof of exploit, I put truncated. That's what that truncated does. So then you only have the relevant output. And you can also bold things that are interesting. Like, look, we received a connection, bold. Attacking target, bold. Got certificate, bold. And written to file, all this can be bolded. And the way you bold in Sysraptor is, as I also did this, but you could see those special symbols. You can also customize that symbol too. If you do highlight manual and then you do an equal, so you can specify whatever symbol you want to be the bolding symbol. Make sense? Yes. Okay, cool. So now that we have this PFX, we can get the NT hash for the user. So how do we do that? Well, I would just use certipy. That's the most straightforward way of doing it. So I don't know if this machine has certipy on it. We're about to find out. No, it doesn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download that certificate and upload it to my Kali machine. That's probably an old one.
We can also use Impacket Rubius.
You can use Rubius, not Impacket, but you can use Rubius. I don't think you can use... I mean, you may be able to use some Impacket tools with the certificate. I don't know off the top of my head, but... But yeah, so Rubius is another way of doing it, and I think that's what I showed maybe last time.
Yes.
Yeah, I showed using /get credential. Yes, that's another way of doing it. Two ways of doing it, so I could do it that way too. But just to show it two different ways, I'll do it differently than I did it last time. Because if you're already on your Kali machine, you might as well not download it. It makes sense to use Rubius if you're, depending on your attack path, if the next thing I'm going to do is DC sync, and I'm using a Windows tool for that, I'm going to use Rubius. But if the next thing I'm going to do is use a Linux tool, no point in putting it on my Windows machine. I'm just going to use what's on Linux. But yes, either way. Also, I put it in the wrong directory, so that's a little annoying, but that's fine. I can just go. And now if I do certipy auth pfx pi.pfx, I may have to specify the DCIP. Boom, now we have the hash. And so now,
And
you also got a TGT if you want it. So you have the TGT and the hash. And so from there, you can use the hash to authenticate. So for example, nxc smb dc1-user rpi-h for hash, paste, boom. And you only need the NT hash, right? This is NTLM. You need the NT portion, so LM is optional. You could also, since there is LM, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe the presence of LM here indicates that they are using LM hashes, which is outdated and can also be another finding, LM enabled. Again, that's not super important if you don't have that finding, not a big deal. Anyway, so see, we authenticated. This plus sign means we authenticated. I can list, for example, shares on the domain controller. The other way I can authenticate is with the Kerberos ticket, so I might as well take this time to show you how to do that in Linux. So export krb5cc name. It's just an environment variable that you have to remember. And then the name of the ticket, so rpi.ccache. And then I can also use netexec again. Hopefully this works. But instead of using the hash, it's use kcache, I think. We're about to find out if I remember that correctly or not. Yep, there you go. So you can say it says from ccache. So from that ticket file, also authenticated. And so you can use a TGT, or you could, if you did a different attack path and happen to have the service ticket, like a CIFS service ticket, that's all you need to do SMB stuff, right? So TGT or CIFS service ticket work. But easiest thing to do is just use the hash because you can. Okay, cool. So that's how we got domain access. Ready to get domain admin? Yes. All right. So now that we have domain access.
So, good question. So we did relaying instead of cracking. That's
yes.
why it took so much long time to get domain. If we directly have used hashcat.
Yes, I mean it depends how fast the hash cracks too. Like if you're using RockU, it can go through really fast. But if you're
crack, we can relay it.
Yeah. So sometimes like I'll submit a hash for cracking and I'll still relay it just to already get domain access. Okay. And then maybe like if I don't get it through relaying, or if I can't relay it and then I see it cracks later, I'm like, oh, it cracked. Because usually passwords don't crack like instantly. It usually takes a little bit of time. It just depends where it is in the list, right? Yeah. So, but having that hash cracked, you have their password, which is easiest to use a password for everything. So anyway, now that we are authenticated, look at these new options that we have. We can do all the coercion stuff. So like we talked about, coercing domain machines for the most part is not super useful because machine accounts don't have access to anything like major. The only thing that you could really do with a machine account is relay to LDAP and then gain a service ticket for yourself for that machine account so you can log in as a local admin, right? But keep in mind, this only works for the most part if you're using HTTP or WebDAV, right? Or if it's NetNTLM v1, right? If you have NetNTLM v2 SMB, which most of those coercion attacks give you back a NetNTLM v2 SMB hash, you can't even relay to LDAP. So the only thing you can really do is relay to SMB on another machine where you'll have no privileges.
You did not mention NetNTLM v1 ESS.
I didn't because forget it. That is applicable when we're talking about rainbow tables.
Okay.
But like I said, don't worry about it for relays. Just worry about this. And then if you get a hash, try cracking it. Don't worry about the rainbow tables. Make sense?
In the very unlikely case that they give us domain credentials, we already have initial access to the domain. Everything else we skip over. We don't have to do anything. We just go directly to coercion. Right?
Yes and no. When you're doing a test, you still want to give them what an attacker would be able to do, right?
Gotcha.
So you would still try these things. Like even if I already have domain credentials, I'm still trying to get on the domain pretending I don't have them. It's just a nice thing to have as a backup in case I'm not able to get initial domain access. I don't have to go and then request them give it to me. You know what I mean? But yeah, I would still absolutely try to get initial domain
We
access.
have to do it because I want to let me know that if it's HTTP or net and like web tabs, to know which type of service we have.
Well, either way, LMNR enables is going to be a finding. And whether it's SMB or HTTP that you're receiving doesn't really matter. Like, you're assuming that that's required for business purpose. Yeah. So, but yes, you would still try LMNR because LMNR is a vulnerability. Yeah. Okay. So, now let's domain admin time with coercion. But okay, so we haven't talked about WebDAV yet. We haven't talked about this stuff yet. Saving that. But notably, where this becomes most relevant is for a DC, for a domain controller machine account. Let's say that domain controller machine account gives us a net NTLM v1 hash, right? We could relay that to LDAP, and we can gain access to that account through RBCD or through shadow creds, right? So let's try that. So always, as part of a pen test, I'm going to run all those coercion attacks, see which ones work. Each of those is a separate finding. And in addition, if I receive a net NTLM v1 hash, that is also a separate finding called net NTLM v1 enabled. I think one of you did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's run responder. Okay, but remember this time we're just capturing the credential, right? So let's try petit potem, for example. And let's try capturing it. So responder with -A this time because we're capturing it. And then we're going to run the coercion, and we can use netexec for that. So copying it directly from the sheet here, right? We got, and I lost my connection, so I'm going to have to rerun it. Hello? Oh, is my VPN failing me? Okay, yeah, my VPN for whatever reason just like bugged out on me. But there we go. Okay, so if I go to sudo test cd tools, I'm blanking, sorry. We go to responder. We're gonna do sudo, I don't need sudo because I'm already root, python 3 responder.py -i ens18 -a for analyze mode. And now I can just do this from my Kali machine because I have this on my Kali machine. netexec smb DC's IP. I'll try all of them to see which ones work. Also, I'm in the wrong folder again. Shared workspace, DC's IP.txt, and now I need to specify those user creds, right? So pi. And then password, but again, let's pretend we didn't have the password. We do have the hash, so I can just use the hash. And then from here, we say module coerce plus, and then by default, it'll So if I just run this on its own, it's not actually gonna do the coercion. Oh, I forgot. I'm old version of netexec. Give me 1 second to update it. pipx reinstall. Like I said, this was just added like 2 weeks ago. So if you're running on old version from before 2 weeks ago, you're gonna have to reinstall it.
On the Kali machine, you get
netexec does not come in Kali by default, but the setup script that is in the GitHub that you will run installs netexec from source, from the GitHub. So you'll have the latest version.
Okay.
I'm just thinking of other stuff.
Yeah. And the other thing that you should know about the setup script, I think I included in the setup script, it logs all commands to var log commands.log with a timestamp. So if they ask you, did you run this? What time did you run this? Was this you? Your log is in var log commands.log. You can see all the commands you ran on Linux and be like, this is what we ran at that time, which they might throw something like that at you. Because I have had clients come to me and be like, when did you run this? We're seeing like weird alerts for it. I'll be like, I ran it on December 5th at 12:31 p.m. You know?
So if they ask for a specific command, who ran it, everybody will know
everybody.
whether they're the one who ran it, and then they go to their var log.
Yeah.
And then, or maybe I can be like, oh yeah, I ran it, and then Gino can go to the machine real quick and we can make it look like
But it should be wise.
So if I just run coerce plus on its own, it'll show you all of the coercion attacks that the DC is vulnerable to. So in this case, it's 3 out of 5 of them. It's DFS coerce, petit podum, 4 out of 5 of them, printer bug, and MS even. So yeah, so these are all the different styles, and notice that we didn't get any I didn't even set the listen IP there, so we didn't actually do the coercion, but we checked for it, right? And so now I can choose any one of these, doesn't matter which one. So let's say I do. Sure. Actually, that one, for some reason, I was like playing around with it earlier and it wasn't working for me, so I'm just gonna not do that one. But this I actually did test out earlier. M and L. So L is the IP address that we wanted to auth back to. So in this case, we wanted to auth back to the machine that is running responder, right? So that's 192.168.12.6. Boom, it says exploit success, and if we go back here, we have the hash for the machine account. In this case, net NTLM v2, not very helpful for us. There's not much we can do with that. But let's see, I should have also gotten DC1. That is skipping because I already previously captured it because I was testing this before. Sorry, guys. So what I'll do is I'll remove the responder database and I'll rerun this again and we'll get a fresh perspective. Okay. Now you can see we captured it, and you can see whereas for DC2 it's net NTLM v2, for DC1 it's net NTLM v1, a vulnerability. So we can actually take that hash, relay it to DC2, to LDAP on DC2, and configure shadow creds on DC1 to then get the NT hash for DC1, similar to how we did for that user, right? So do you want to do shadow creds or RBCD? It's kind of like either way. Shadow creds is kind of easier, but RBCD is the other method. Do I have any conflicting votes for RBCD here?
He said it for shadow creds.
Because I did just show shadow creds, so I wouldn't feel bad if you were like, I want to see RBCD this time. But we can do shadow creds. All right. So we're going to run it again. This time we're just going to do DC1 instead of both of them. That's cptc.local. And this time, instead of capturing it, so I'm going to kill this, we want to relay it. So relay, NTLM relay x.py-t, right? Pretty self-explanatory. And then we want to configure shadow creds, so we'll do -- shadow credentials. Yes, correct. Sorry, I had RBCD in my head. So I think if I have NTLM relay X here in my history, no, I do not, because that would be too easy, right? NTLM relay X .pi -t LDAP on the other domain controller, so DC2, because you can't relay to yourself. That just doesn't make sense. You can't authenticate from yourself to yourself. We can remove, no, I'm not going to remove anything. We have to say -SMB2 support. If you're relaying, okay, so if you want to capture SMB, you have to include SMB2 support or it won't capture it. The other thing we need is we're relaying from SMB to LDAP. So by default, it won't do it because it'll be like, oh, it's an SMB hash. You're not supposed to be able to relay this to LDAP. So you have to say remove MIC for it to know that we want to relay to LDAP. If you ever forget this, you can always go on Hacker Recipes, or you can look it up, or I'll try to include this. Now that I'm remembering about this, I'll try to include it in my cheat sheet, but I'm sure there will be more things that I will remember as I go along that I didn't remember when I was putting it together. So, okay. And then the last thing, shadow credentials. And I think that should be good. So we're going to run that. We're going to coerce DC1. And boom. So coerced, target user found, we relayed, we got a PFX. That must be used with this password. So they even give you, like, if you want to use PK init tools to get a TGT from it, you can. I think you can just do it directly with Certify without having to go through PK init tools. We're about to find out. Because I usually use RBCD for this, so this is new for me, which I'm okay with. I learned. We are in, I'm trying to look for this certificate. Here it is. So I'm going to upload this to my Kali machine like we did before. Or actually, I'll just do this directly in Rubius. I should be able to get a TGT for it because that's what we need in the end anyway. We don't need the NT hash, we need TGT because we're going to DC sync. Cool. So we download this to tools. And hopefully it works. Okay. And now we're in tools. Let's make sure it's there. We have our PFX. And now, can I do this off the top of my head is the real question. Ask TGT, domain, DC. Oh, actually I don't think it matters, but just in case, I'm going to not request it from the DC I'm like getting the ticket for. Again, I don't think it matters, but just in case. User. The user here is the DC1 machine account. So DC1 dollars, correct. And let me just double check that so I'm not crazy. DC1 dollars, yep. Certificate, and then IJ. It's not letting me autocomplete, which makes me very sad. That's okay. And then password, the password that it gave us for the certificate. This is not a password for the account. This is a password for the certificate that it just generated. I don't know why, like in this case, it generates a password. In the other case, it didn't. I'm not 100% sure, but whatever. If it has a password, you just include the password and pass the ticket. And of course, if I wanted the NT hash, I could also say get credentials, I think, / get credentials. But whatever, I just need a ticket. Please work, please work, please, 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 please. Yes. K-list. We have our TGT for DC1. Now we can do a DC sync. That I do not remember the DSN. Once I remember this command, but I don't remember the actual command to do the DC sync. So I might grab that off our thing, or it's like get AD REPL account, but whatever. Reporting. Raptor 14. Skip. Templates. And it's probably going to be here? No. Yes. I think. Maybe?
I was just gonna escape out this one. It's once you have like high privileges and then
No, I didn't.
get all the passwords for the domain accounts.
Yeah, so right, that is what I'm doing right now. So there we go. Get 80 REPL account. There you go. And I just have to replace DC with the DC. Because I am DC1, I cannot DC sync from myself, because the whole point of DC sync is you're asking for changes from another domain controller. So I have to do DC2. And when you see that's happy days. That's when you get to smile and be like, I'm a winner. And then if I go to C tools, DC sync. Beautiful. And we have it for we have the NT hash. Yeah. And if there are any LM, for sure here, if there are any LM hashes, that's another finding, LM enabled. Although I'm not seeing LM hashes, so there may just not be. But, and then from here, how do you actually parse this file? DS internals parser, which I hope I did not include here, but that's okay. This is actually a fork of the original tool that was made by my mentor at NetSpy, so credit to him for this fork of DS internals parser. I honestly don't know the difference between this and the original tool, but all I know is that you grab this, you can download it, you need to run this on a Windows machine with Python. Actually, you may be able to run it on a Linux machine, but you need Python. So I don't know if we have Python on here. If we don't, I may have to install it. I was going to add Python to the installation script. It looks like I did, actually, because it's showing up like this. Also, I'm stupid because I already, in the installation script, I forgot. Yeah, so don't even worry about it. In the installation script, it'll install the DS internals parser to the tool directory for you. Oh, I love my old self. All right. Thank you, old me. Python DS internals parser to see how it's used. In case you forget, -h, and then DC sync, and then --NTLM to get just a list of username and NTLM hash. So I can then go to output NTLM, and boom, we just have the accounts, their hash. And so from here, what I would do in the real world is we want to give them an audit of their passwords to see which passwords are weak and crackable, right? So from here, what I would do is I would get rid of everything before the colon, just keep the hashes, throw those into Hashcat, and then see which ones crack. And then later on, you'll have to map them back to the original user, which is a little annoying. And I did create a script for it that I should have uploaded to the GitHub. But anyway, I asked ChatGPT to write me one, so you can do the same thing. You can say, I have one file that has username hash separated by colon, another file that has this, and write me a script that'll combine them, and it'll do it. But how do you actually remove, like, before the colon? There's a cut. Yes, so in Linux, you can use cut, right? Cut, -delimiter, colon, -field 2. In Windows, if this has Notepad++, which I think I also installed for you, you're welcome. You can also do, like, find and replace magic. So if I do find, I'm totally doing this. I usually do this in Linux, so I'm totally kind of like doing this off the top of my head. We're going to see if it works. Maybe? Regular expression. There we go. Yep. And if I do replace that with nothing, replace all, boom, we just have the hashes. And then I can also get rid of empty lines with another regex. Yes. And replace it with nothing. Or actually, this I have to mark. Whatever. Point is, I then remove empty lines, which I could definitely do by hand here, because there are too many. And then this I would throw in for hash cracking, like this. Make sense?
Yes. And then you keep the original files.
And I would keep the original output NTLM file so I can map it back. And then, if you look at my verbiage for this, my verbiage here is Cyberhawks was able to correct. Well, you'd have to change Cyberhawks to team. Team number, I would put the number too, but was able to crack the passwords for blank accounts, blank unique passwords. Below is a summary of Active Directory domain accounts configured with weak passwords. And then I'd call out specific interesting ones, like if it has password in it, if it has welcome in it. Those are things that an attacker could guess in a password spray, right? So those I like to explicitly call out. Curb roasting, you can, or service accounts, you can curb roast. So call those out. Yeah, those are things I like to call out.
This would be the very last step.
Last step.
Yeah.
If you don't get to this, don't worry about it. Like icing on the cake. If you don't do this, if you don't have enough time to like run this and write this up, least important, I would say. I actually recently changed my verbiage of how I write this up, where I also say like for X out of Y accounts. So I'll say for like 20% of the accounts we were able to crack. But you know, this is good enough.
What you did in 30 minutes, we're gonna have to do in 7 hours.
Yeah. But this is like what I'm showing you right now. This exact attack path I did last week for a big company. I can't tell you because I'm not allowed to tell you, but you have heard of this company, trust me. And they're like international, and this worked. So it's a thing. Just letting you know, like these attacks that we're doing. FBI. Yes, I'm part of the FBI. No, just kidding. Like these attacks, they work. And it's like I say, it's not that hard to pull off. Obviously, you have to have a lot of background knowledge to be able to pull this off. But like from somebody who has, if you have background knowledge, I could do this in like 20 minutes if I wasn't explaining it all. And I had my attack machine like fully set up and everything. Less than 20 minutes. The other thing to note is remember, every action you take, you have to undo. So what we did here, we updated the MSDS key credential link attribute of DC1. So we also have to undo that. So how do we undo these things? Well, to undo updates to MSDS key credential link attribute, you probably could do that in MMC, but I love using Whisker because Whisker just makes it easy. So if I have, do I have it? So I have, first of all, I'm going to need to have a TGT of an account, which let's finish the attack path. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Finish the attack path. So from here, we have the hashes for domain admins, right? Let's figure out who's a domain admin. I could do that in Bloodhound, which would probably be easiest, but since I don't have Bloodhound open, I'll get AD group domain admins -server dc1.cptc.local. Oh, sorry, it's get AD group member. Whatever. It'll run this, and it won't give me what I want. Get AD group member. Boop. And the only one here in this case is administrator, so we're going to look for administrator here. There we go. And their hash is right here. So to illustrate impact, what I always do is I go to my Kali machine and I say evil winrm -I 192.168, and I pick a domain controller. So this is just a domain controller. User administrator hash paste. And I like to do this to illustrate impact, because otherwise clients are like, okay, so what? You got all the hashes of all the accounts in the domain.
So what?
But, I mean, True, like that's a big deal, but I think it's more tangible to be able to understand the impact when you can say, I have a session on your domain controller. I can run commands on your domain controller. So I like to do this and then say, who am I group? It might be groups. I always do group singular. I don't know why. And then you can see that we are in the domain admins group, and it's very clear here. We have a session running on a domain controller, and we're in the domain admins group. We can do anything, right?
The command which you ran, like the evil. So what exactly it is trying to do there?
Okay, so this goes into a lateral movement. There are many ways we can move laterally. So in a previous seminar, we used WMI exec, right? This is just another option, and this uses WinRM, so port 5985. And I like to use WinRM in the real world pen testing because WinRM is like a legitimate thing that doesn't get blocked by EDR usually. Like if you're a domain admin, you can usually WinRM and get a command session running without having to worry about like antivirus or EDR blocking you.
So it's just creating a session into that particular
using
domain,
the WinRM protocol.
Yeah. Okay. So in that DC, it's creating a session from administrative account.
Yeah. So we just logged in. It's basically like you pretend you SSH'd in. It's the same thing. WinRM is like the Windows equivalent of SSH. Not exactly because Windows can also use SSH, but yeah.
-I domain DC1 IP is necessary, right?
Yeah. So I could have also done I don't know why. I just know the IP, so I did it. I could have also done DC1. I could have said DC1, I think. There are a lot of things that I like should know off the top of my head, but I just like do what works. But yeah, see, so it doesn't matter. But the -I is just the target, and if you ever forget, -I, and it does say IP, which is kind of funny. Oh, it does say full FQDN for Kerberos auth. So that's actually really interesting. I did not know that. But if you use the fully qualified domain name, it uses Kerberos auth, whereas if you use the IP, I believe it uses NTLM auth. So interesting. Not that it matters.
This probably doesn't matter a lot, but I just wanted to know if the result.conf has cptc.local, then you can just do DC1, right? -I DC1.
Probably. I always specify just in case because I'm always paranoid about that, but we're about to find out. But I think you're right. I would imagine so. Yep. There you go. And this actually might even be the cleanest way to put it in a report, depending on how you want it to. Remember to redact this in your report. Cannot have that hash. So all passwords or hashes in a report should be redacted. So in addition to the truncated thing that you saw, you might have seen I put the same thing, but I just said redact instead of truncate, right? So in a screenshot, you would cover it up or you would blur it out. But in a code block, you would just put redacted.
Okay, from the competition's perspective, couldn't they argue that, like, how do we actually know that you have the right passwords? Like, we can just
no, redact it. In the real world, you would, and it's clear enough. Like, I mean, sure, you could probably.
I can include other proofs that. Hey,
yeah, you could probably like figure out what this is gonna look like and like type it out, but. That'd be kind of hard, you know. So, yeah, I think it's proof enough to be like, look, here's the command, and here's the output. To me, that's proof enough. But if you wanted, if they request it, if the client follows up, for example, and requests and says, hey, can you prove that you have the hash? You can say, are you comfortable with me communicating the hash to you? And they're like, yes. And then I'll say, okay, here it is, proof. So if they ask you, communicate it that way. But otherwise, don't worry about it. You proved it.
Don't worry about it. And for the initial kickoff call, I don't mention this. Like it in my head,
no.
So it's rejected.
Yeah. And well, here's the other thing. If the attack works and you reported it, like they'll know whether the attack works or not. You know what I mean? If you reported just a random attack that doesn't work, it's going to be like you reported a random attack that doesn't work. So like
know what works and what doesn't.
So like if they see that you have to be able to do this in order to report it, right? So if they go back into their environment and they're like, oh, we don't have a web enrollment portal, it's like, Why did you put that on the report in the first place? Anyway.
What if I'm very, very lucky they do?
What if you just guessed? And they happen to have one. Well, then you could have pulled off the attack, so what do they know? No, just kidding. I don't know. Anyway, so yes, so cleanup. So Whisker. Okay, let's purge what we have here. Okay, let's purge to purge our current tickets, and let's import an admin ticket. So Rubius.exe, I'm going to ask TGT for an admin domain, cptc.local, DC, DC1. Again, I probably don't need the fully qualified domain name, so I'm not going to put it. User, administrator, RC4. Hopefully I have it copied. I do not have it copied. Good job, John. Now you have to retype the whole thing. Oop, okay. And now we're going to grab it from here. Copy. And then pass the ticket. Boom. Wow, that was fast. K-list. We have an administrator ticket. Now we can do anything we want as administrator. So the first thing I'll do is I'll run whisker .exe and list. And then domain DC, and then target, which in this case is going to be DC1. And this will show us our key credentials for that account. And technically I should have, so as you can see, we have a credential here and it shows up and the creation time. So we know that this is the one that we created, right? So this is the one that we're going to remove. Since it's the only one, I can just say clear, which I think removes all of them. If there was another one though, you don't want to make changes to the client environment. So you keep that one and just remove the one that's yours, right? Also, this date is totally off, so ignore that. But so now we clear that. It might take some time, but ideally it's cleared. See how it says updating. And then the next thing we're going to do, I'm already going to jump ahead a little bit, is we're going to have to revoke that certificate, which had ID 11, I believe, if I remember correctly. So I can just go here where I should have the same tickets imported. Yeah, so if I do MMC. Oh, keep in mind, if you import tickets into like one session, for the most part, it like automatically transfers to all your other like command or PowerShell sessions. Although I've seen it not do that before, and I still don't understand why sometimes it does do that and sometimes it doesn't. So just like double verify. But if I run MMC, actually I don't think I need the / because it's not in the current directory. And then I'm going to do file, add remove snap-in, and in this case, we want certification authority, another computer, ca.cptc.local. Okay, boom. You could also remove it with Active Directory PowerShell, I'm sure. Or maybe not Active Directory PowerShell, but there's another PowerShell, but we love it taking forever. How is this doing? Also taking forever. Okay, anyway, this loaded. So here we have our CA. Here we have issued certificates. We see 11. And honestly, probably this one was also the result of me testing stuff out in the past and I forgot to revoke the certificate. So bad on me. But right click, all tasks, revoke certificate. And then the reason code, I like to say key compromise because we have the key, so it's been compromised. I'll say yes. And then it will have moved to revoked certificates, and so it's no longer valid. And so if I try to use that certificate in the future, it wouldn't work.
This is only the last hour once I have reported everything.
Yes.
And then try and clean it.
If you don't have time for it, you can always just go to the client and be like, this is what needs to be done. And be like, we couldn't do it, or something like that.
And doesn't have to be on the report, right? The cleanup.
No, cleanup, don't put on the report. Yep.
Actually, a question popped in my head. So, if the scenario is like you said earlier, that we're probably gonna be on the same subnet as the target, we don't have to worry about like jump outs or anything. Something that they mentioned is that at 6 p.m. we're gonna lose access to the environment.
That is a good point.
So,
now the question is, are they going to kill the environment we're targeting, or are they going to kill access to everything?
If it's the same subnet, how are we, like, which environment are we going to lose access to? In which case,
so maybe it would have been good to ask that question in the Discord, which I'm sure we can still
because
ask.
It's confusing. Like, what do they mean by you lose access to the environment? Which one?
Yeah.
So we can't use Sysraptor after 6 p.m. Right?
My guess would be that they don't take away your access to your attacking machines, because, like, let's say you gathered evidence but you didn't put it in the report, you just have it on your attacking machine. Like, let's say you're not as prepared as us, where we're like, we're going to put it in Sysraptor. Let's say you're doing a Word document, like, it wouldn't make sense for them to take away access to the Kali and Windows, right?
Why would they have like a reporting time if you couldn't build a report?
Right, exactly. If you had to have the report done by then.
I need to clarify that.
Yeah.
Maybe on Discord.
Yeah, I think Discord would be the best way. But anyway.
I just looked through that fake cube. I don't know how to answer that question.
Yeah.
It does not answer that question in an FAQ.
Makes sense.
Also, setting up Sysraptor, you said it's very easy, right?
Oh yeah, it's all Docker. So you just install Docker, and then you Docker compose in the Docker compose file, and then it's done. Yeah. Although the one change, and I think Lucas knows this, and as long as one person knows this, that's all we need, is yes, by default it will only listen locally, so you won't be able to access it from other machines. So in the Docker compose file, you just have to replace all of 127.0.0.1 with 0.0.0.0, so it listens on all interfaces. Now, again, like I said last time, I think, technically, if we're in the client environment doing that, that's not the best thing, because then everybody can see our Sysraptor instance. Like, everybody in the environment can see our Sysraptor instance, but
they don't have credentials.
They also, that's true, they don't have credentials. Yeah, I think it's fine.
Yeah.
And that's not something you're going to monitor for, because that's not like active traffic, you know what I mean? Yeah. That's like it's just like an exposed service, so unless they're doing scans.
Imagine somebody finds a Sysraptor webpage. They think it belongs to the target, and they try password spraying or whatever.
So use a strong Sysraptor password. That would be a good call, yes. You know. If they happen to guess Raptor and reporting, which
reporting
is
probably on rockU.txt.
I doubt it, but maybe. Also,
along these lines, though, if the other computers IP address are in the same range, we should attack them. Sure. Maybe they're running Sysraptor.
Exactly.
Curious if they're gonna say.
So something to keep in mind too, just you learn all these like little things when you work with the Windows command line for a long time. But for example, here the command was just not running, and I just pressed enter a few times, and it turns out it was already done. It just didn't print it out. So sometimes just remember to press enter if it's like not doing anything.
Especially on Windows. And so if you press enter right now to add a new line.
Yeah.
I think we covered everything for.
Okay. So see how it says on the top here, administrator command prompt. Now click in the terminal. Like click anywhere, click and drag. Now
select.
Yep. It won't print anything if it says selected up here.
That's true. You're right, because it's thinking you're copy and pasting.
And it annoyed me for years and years and years until it actually tells you.
And here's another thing that I learned. Just like if you're outside the window and you click into the window and you want to paste something in the window, sometimes it just won't paste. So I always like type something, backspace, and then paste.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Paste is annoying too.
Yeah. So you might have, I actually did that automatically before I ran Rubius, I think. I did that before I pasted the password. I went, because I'm just so used to that happening. But the things you learn just from doing it over and over. And then the remote solution that we use at NetSpy has its own like intricacies that you have to keep in mind when copy and pasting. Like sometimes you have to double click the copy and paste enable disable button a few times, and so I have my automatic like click click. Yeah, it's very funny. Okay, this was supposed to be half of the presentation. That's okay. We covered everything NTLM, and in the past we've already covered everything Active Directory, so you may want to brush up on, like we were brushing up last time, on the Kerberos authentication and ASREP roasting and Kerber roasting, but yeah, as long as one person knows it, that's what matters. And we covered NTLM.
Can we take 2-minute break for bathroom? Yes. Sorry. And then
Can I say one last thing?
Sure. Yes.
Because I forgot about this, guys. So, the idea here is most of the time when you use these coerced auth attacks, you get hashes back over SMB rather than HTTP or WebDAV, right? Okay. Remember, with SMB, you're limited in what you can do. So, for example, you can't relay in most cases to LDAP. So, if you actually want to gain access to that machine, you can't relay to LDAP and request service tickets like you normally would be able to do or configure RBCD, right? So, however, there's a way around this. If there's a special service called the Web Client Service that may be running if they're using anything that requires WebDAV. So SharePoint, so like Microsoft products, which they could be because they're giving you an Office 365 account. Office 365 has SharePoint, so very likely you'll see Web Client Service enabled. The way you check for this, 2 ways. You can use the original tool, or you can use netexec with the WebDAV module. And that will, if you run it against all the machines in the domain, you'll see which ones have that Web Client Service enabled, right? Mm-hmm. If that Web Client Service is enabled, you can run that coercion attack slightly differently, specifying this target slightly differently, and you'll get a WebDAV hash instead of an SMB hash. And WebDAV hashes are the same as HTTP. They can be relayed anywhere. So they can be relayed to LDAP, right? And then you can configure RBCD and then gain local admin access to that machine. Long story short, if that web client service is enabled, not instant, but like you can get local admin access on that machine. It's just a matter of going through the process, right? So the interesting caveat here, though, is you need to specify a NetBIOS name or a shorthand name for your machine. Like when we said DC1, NetBIOS name, right? But your attacking machine by default isn't domain joined, so it doesn't have a NetBIOS name. So there are 2 ways to get a NetBIOS name, or 2 major ways. There are other ways too. One is LMNR, MDNS, NBNS poisoning, right? If you specify the name of a non-existent device, then you respond to that LMNR request and say, I have the IP for that device, right? So in that case, you would just specify a bogus NetBIOS name, but keep responder running for poisoning. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Option 2 is ADI DNS poisoning. So that's once you already have domain access, that's a prerequisite. You can add yourself using DNS tool to the you can create a record for yourself on the domain controller in most cases. So that's a second way of doing it. Point is, you would pick one of these 2 ways of giving yourself a NetBIOS name, and then you would rerun the coercion attack. But this time, you would specify the target a little bit differently to match, right? So if you gave yourself a NetBIOS name through AD-DNS poisoning, let's say you gave yourself the name Pentest, you would specify your target as Pentest, right? Whereas if you were using LMNR and BNS poisoning, you just have to specify any name of a machine that does not exist. And then the whole end result of this is you get a WebDAV hash as opposed to an SMB hash. And a WebDAV net NTLM v2, right, as opposed to SMB. And if you get that, you can also relay to LDAP. So, sorry, I know I threw that at you really fast, but just keep in mind, these by default give you SMB. If you want LDAP, you have to go, if you want WebDAV, you have to go through this process here. Another thing to note is you can't use netexec for this because you have to like very clearly specify the target in this format. So you'd have to use the original tool. So I didn't write it out for all of these, but Petit Podem and DFS course usually work by default. So you would use the original tool like Petit Podem DFS course and just specify the target in this format. Make sense? Hopefully you don't run into a scenario where you have to do that, but just so you know that's out there. So keep that in mind. If you do run into that scenario, you'll figure it out.
Just a quick question in general. On the template, we have AD environment, internal, external, web, whatever. For NTLM, should we just throw them on the AD?
Yeah, I would throw it on AD. You could have even created like a separate one, but
called what?
NTLM. Yeah, NTLM authentication, I guess. I would say, but
You could add it.
yeah, but also just putting it in AD is fine. I lied. It depends. I'm thinking about how I report this. I report LLM&R, MDNS, NPNS as internal, or internal network. Why? Because you might have non-domain joined machines that are giving you credentials, right? They don't necessarily have to be domain joined. You can use it. Let's say you get a hash for a local account, right? And you're able to crack that. Then you can get onto that local account. So it's not necessarily AD. So that would be internal network. However, ADCS ESC8 is ADCS, so that gets reported in the Active Directory. And weak passwords for domain accounts get reported in Active Directory. Whereas weak passwords for local accounts, kind of up to you, but it may make sense to report those, if it's not a domain joined machine especially, it would make sense to report those in the internal network section.
For us, it's either going to be internal or
Yeah.
For his part, it's internal, all of it. Kushal.
Yes, Kushal's part is all internal. Mostly.
And we're going to
Mostly.
report some internal too. But
I'll talk
anyway.
about the exceptions to that. 5 minutes.
Is it okay?
Yes, no, take a break. Guys, if you have to go to the bathroom.
Continue first.
Oh yeah, no, we can continue. While you're taking a break, I'm actually going to show this WebDAV coercion, and so if you watch the video later, you can watch it.
Perfect.
So I'm going to explain it like I'm talking to you guys, but it's okay if you aren't here.
So is it there like the web client service in our environment?
Yes, I did put it on one machine,
Then I'll
just so you can practice with
yes.
it. So you received WebDAV hashes in LLM&R. Remember when we initially were looking at it?
Yes.
If you see WebDAV, the web client service is enabled.
Okay.
So for sure, if you see a WebDAV hash, you know that there's at least one machine with web client service enabled. Yep. So for my people who stayed and for my people who are watching this video afterwards, who are very overwhelmed with all the things that I've been showing.
Not overwhelmed. You do an amazing job explaining.
I'm so glad. It'll be interesting to me to see how much you like get out of this after the competition, like what you were able to do. That will tell me how good a teacher I am. So first we have to find machines that have find computers that have that web client service enabled. So in order to do that, first I need a list of domain computers so that I know them. And there are a couple ways I can go about doing this. So there's get AD computers, which is a impacket script, and then you just have to play around with the output a little bit to get it to work. Alternatively, because from that initial relay that we did, we dumped domain info, and as part of that, we dumped domain computers, right? So we already have that. Another thing I could do is I could actually run LDAP domain dump and actually dump exactly what we did when we relayed. So a few different ways of getting all the domain computers. But taking a look at it here, if I cat domain computers.grep, you'll notice it has a lot of information we don't need, but what we do need is just these domain names, right? So I'm actually I could just cut delimiter, and because I'm using a special tab character, I just learned this from trial and error, I have to put a $sign before it. I don't entirely know the reason why. I think it's just to allow the use of the tab character, but whatever. And the field, which I believe is 1, 2, 3. And domain computers.grep. And it says it must be a single character, so maybe I do need to do. There we go. So yeah, so now we have the domain computers. Of course, I can get rid of this DNS host name and this blank line. So I'll just do egrep -v. I'm going to be fancy about it because I can. And then get rid of the blank line, and then get rid of DNS. Boom. So now we have all those, and I could save that to a file, computers.txt. And now we're going to upload computers.txt to my Kali machine, because I don't think I have netexec on here, but maybe I do. I do have netexec on here. Never mind. I don't even have to do that. So I'll say netexec smb computers.txt user rpi hash that I forgot. You should definitely be keeping better track of this than I am, because I'm just kind of doing this willy-nilly. But I love the word willy-nilly. I very rarely get to use that word. Isn't that such a fun word, willy-nilly? And then -m webdev. And now we'll know which computers have that webdev client service enabled. And you can see that web client service is enabled on 192.168.12.15, which happens to be PC2. So that means we can only run this variation of the attack to get the webdev hash for PC2. But that means we essentially, assuming there's no LDAP signing on the domain controllers, that means that we can gain local admin on PC2. So how do we do that? Well, just to demonstrate that we do get that webdev hash, let's do this first. So I'll run responder with -a. And now here, I'm going to run petit podum, the tool itself, which if you use my setup script, it's already installed as petit podum. As you can see, I was playing around with this earlier, but rpi -hash. I think it's specified the same way. I'm not 100% sure, but we're about to find out. Paste. And then now I have to be careful on how I specify the target, right? So we can either approach this one of two ways. We can do poisoning and then specify bogus name, or we could use DNS tool to add a record, right, for our attacking machine. So I'm just going to use poisoning because we know poisoning works. And so that's easiest. So actually, instead of -a, I have to do -w so that I'm poisoning. And again, this is written out in that sheet right here. If you ended up doing the poisoning option, you have to do with -w. Okay, cool. So running with -w for poisoning. And then now I have to be careful how I specify this. I'm just going to copy it from here. We're going to specify some bogus, doesn't matter what it is, name, as long as it's not the name of an existing machine, at and the port number, which can be any port number that NTLM responder will pick up, which 80 is one that he'll pick up, and then the machine that I'm trying to coerce, so in this case PC2. And if this doesn't work, I'm going to try with the IP address, but I think I should be able to just do the domain name.
And file.txt was a file.
File.txt is just a random file. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be anything, right? Also, apparently, it doesn't like hashes specified that way. Apparently, I have to do hashes. So it's the in-packet way of specifying it, which is like this. And then I probably need that colon there. And bad username or authentication information. Maybe I don't need a colon there. If I knew my tooling, that would be awesome. But I don't know my tooling, apparently. It doesn't look like they have the colon there, so that's kind of weird to me. Logon failure. That's so weird. Well, anyway, I can do it knowing the user's password. You can do it with a hash. I'm just forgetting how you do it off the top of my head. But with the password, we're going to do, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And again, it can be the password of any domain user. And it could be a machine account too. So if I didn't have a password, I could just use that hash to create a machine account, and I could use the machine account. So many different ways of doing this. Point is, there we go. Binding, and we see we retrieved a webdav hash. Nope, that's RPi. There we go. Webdav hash for PC2. Beautiful. So now that we retrieve that, instead of doing this in responder, remember we still have to do the poisoning. So we're still going to have responder running, and I did reflect that here, right? We still have responder running, but this time we additionally run NTLM relay X to relay it. So NTLM relay X .pi -target LDAP on the domain controller dc1.cptc ptc.local. And then we'll just do delegate access. I'm going to do RBCD this time. I do get to show it. And then normally, okay, so if I just do delegate access by itself, it will create a random machine account and do it for that machine account. But in a real pen test, I would like to not create a randomly named machine account. I'd like to, every machine account that I create should be named something that identifies my company. So I'd say escalate user, and then I'd pick a known machine account like Cyberhawks. And let me just check whether Cyberhawks does exist. If not, I'll create it. Cyberhawks $password. This is the password I probably would give it if it does exist. Yep. Okay, cool. Because I didn't clean up, which is fine. And that should be all we need, hopefully. I think. Started the relay, started the poisoning. Coerce. Boom and boom. You can see it popping up already, turning blue at the top here. So here we had, it didn't show up because, of course, but you can see that request for name bogus that we poisoned. And then from here, boom, we grabbed that authentication. And then we added delegation permissions for Cyberhawks $, and here it says Cyberhawks can now impersonate users on PC2 via S4U2 proxy, right? So at this point, now we can go here, rubius.exe S4U domain cptc.local dc dc1 user, and then we're authenticating as Cyberhawks, and password and then MSD SPN, I think, or something like that. I'm going to hope this is right. And then we can do any service we want. So let's just say we do 6 for PC2. And I could also do alt service, remember, to specify additional services if I wanted to. So I could say alt service, and I could get it for CIFS and LDAP and DCOM, remember, like we did last time, and all that good stuff. And then pass the ticket to pass them into my current session. And an impersonate user, obviously the user we want to impersonate. So I would pick a domain admin. And since I already know from previously that administrator is a domain admin, I'll do administrator. And that's right, it doesn't like a password. I have to specify an RC4 hash, which is really annoying. So I'll just do hash. Actually, I might be able to just do password. Boop, 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 boop. There we go. Now I have the hash. Now I replace this with the hash. Hopefully I did everything else correctly. RC4 hash. Boom. K-list, we have those imported tickets. Okay, to be fair, this may not be the best demo because, let me just remove my TGT for administrator, right? So this is a proper demo. Okay, K-list, and then you see we have DCOM, LDAP, CIFS. So since we have CIFS, I should be able to do something like PC2 and $, which is normally a restricted access share, and now I can, list files. That proves that I have compromise. If I wanted to fully prove compromise, we can do what I did last time. Remember when we used WMI exec with the DCOM ticket? We could do that. We could also use evil WinRM with Kerberos authentication with the ticket. I forget what ticket it requires off the top of my head, but that's another way of doing it, and that would probably not get caught by EDR. So yeah, so from here, that works. And again, just to illustrate, if I say klist purge and get rid of these tickets, hopefully this won't work. And it did work, so that's fun. But let me try like, I am amazed that that works. That is probably a misconfiguration, unless I just have something here they don't realize. Weird. Anyway, whatever. In most cases, that would not work unless you had that ticket that was cached. All right. So I explained the WebDAV thing. Now we're moving on to services, which end of fried brain. This is going to be so much easier to follow, and it's very plug and play, and we're just running the commands straight as they are. So, any last questions about all of that? And what